Hello, dear friend, and welcome to this quiet corner of history. Tonight, we set aside the noise of the present and wander gently into the stories of the past. Whether you're curled up beneath the blankets, resting after a long day, or simply seeking calm company for your evening, I'm grateful you've chosen to be here. If you'd like, share in the comments where in the world you're listening from. I always love seeing how far this community stretches across time zones and continents. And if these soothing journeys through history bring you comfort, consider subscribing so we can meet again. For now, let's loosen the weight of the modern world and step softly into the echoes of yesterday. In the beginning, before there was light or darkness, earth or sky, before there was anything at all, there was only chaos, not the disorder we might imagine, but something far more profound. Picture, if you will, a vast emptiness, pregnant with infinite possibility, like the moment before dawn when all of creation holds its breath. From this primordial void, the first beings slowly emerged, not born but coming into existence through sheer necessity, as if the universe itself dreamed them into being. Gaia, the earth, was the first to take form, broad-bosomed, eternal, the foundation upon which all life would rest. Imagine her as both landscape and living being, her body becoming the mountains and valleys, her breath the wind that stirs the leaves, her blood the rivers that flow to the sea. From her own essence, she brought forth Uranus, the starry sky, who stretched himself above her like a vast canopy of infinite blue, dotted with the lights of distant suns. Gaia and Uranus became lovers, and from their union came the first children of creation, the Titans, beings of immense power and primal force. But Uranus, jealous and fearful of his offspring's strength, refused to allow them to be born, keeping them imprisoned within Gaia's womb. Feel the Earth Mother's pain as she struggled with the weight of her unborn children, her body stretched and aching with their desperate desire for freedom. The mountains trembled with her suffering, and the seas churned with her anguish. Unable to bear the pain any longer, Gaia fashioned a great sickle from the hardest flint and called upon her children for aid. Only the youngest, Kronos, had the courage to answer her plea. In the darkness between day and night, when Uranus descended to embrace his wife, Kronos emerged from his mother's womb, took the adamantine sickle in his hands, and with one swift stroke, castrated his father. The drops of blood that fell upon Gaia's breast became the Furies, the spirits of vengeance, while the severed member, cast into the foam-flecked sea, gave birth to Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, emerging from the waves like a pearl from an oyster. With this act of violence, the first age of the world began. Kronos took his father's place as ruler of the cosmos, but the act that had freed him and his siblings had also cursed him. For Gaia, in her prophetic wisdom, foretold that he, too, would be overthrown by one of his own children. This knowledge poisoned Kronos' reign with paranoia and fear. When he married his sister Rhea, and she began to bear children, Kronos devised a terrible solution to escape his destined fate. As each child was born, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, he snatched them from their mother's arms and swallowed them whole, condemning them to darkness within his own body. Rhea watched in growing horror as her husband devoured child after child. When she became pregnant for the 6th time, she could bear it no longer. Following her mother Gaia's advice, she fled to the island of Crete, where she gave birth in secret to Zeus in a hidden cave on Mount Dicte. The moment of his birth was accompanied by wonders. The bees brought honey to sweeten his lips, the goat Amalthea offered her milk, and the Curetes, young warrior priests, danced around the cave, clashing their bronze shields and spears to drown out the infant's cries. Meanwhile, Rhea returned to Kronos with a large stone wrapped in swaddling clothes. Without hesitation, the Titan king swallowed what he believed to be his newest son, while Zeus grew to manhood in the hidden valleys of Crete, nursed by nymphs and protected by the ancient wisdom of the earth itself. When Zeus reached maturity, he knew his destiny lay not in hiding but in confrontation. Disguised as a cupbearer, he approached his father with a cup of wine mixed with a powerful emetic given to him by Metis, the Titaness of wisdom. Kronos drank deeply, and immediately began to vomit up his children, first the stone he had mistaken for Zeus, then Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Demeter, and Hestia, all fully grown and burning with righteous anger at their imprisonment. The war that followed would reshape the cosmos itself. For 10 long years, the Titanomachy raged, with the young Olympians fighting against the older generation of Titans. The battlefield stretched across all creation, earth shook with the thunder of their combat, the seas boiled, and the very stars seemed to tremble in their courses. Zeus wielded the lightning bolts forged for him by the Cyclopes, whom he had freed from their prison in Tartarus. Poseidon commanded the earthquake and the tsunami, while Hades brought forth the terror of the underworld. The war might have continued forever, balanced between the raw power of the Titans and the innovative strategies of the Olympians, but Zeus made a crucial alliance. Deep in the underworld, imprisoned since the beginning of time, were the hundred-handed ones, beings of such power that even the Titans feared them. Zeus descended into the depths of Tartarus and freed these ancient allies, promising them honor and freedom in exchange for their aid. The final battle was apocalyptic in its scope. The hundred-handed ones hurled entire mountains like stones, while Zeus's lightning split the sky and set the very air ablaze. The defeat of the Titans was complete. Some were cast into Tartarus, others were transformed or fled to the far corners of the earth. Kronos himself, defeated but not destroyed, was imprisoned in the deepest pit of the underworld, where he dreamed still of his lost golden age. With victory achieved, the three brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, divided the cosmos among themselves. They cast lots to determine their domains, and fate assigned Zeus the heavens and the upper air, Poseidon the seas and waters, and Hades the underworld and the realm of the dead. The earth and Olympus were to be shared by all, though Zeus's authority as the wielder of the thunderbolt made him king of gods and mortals alike. But even as Zeus established his reign on Mount Olympus, that magnificent peak that rises into the clouds where Greece meets the sky, new challenges arose. Gaia, though she had aided Zeus against Kronos, was not pleased to see her Titan children imprisoned in Tartarus. In her anger, she coupled with Tartarus himself and gave birth to Typhon, a monster so terrible that even the gods trembled at his approach. Picture Typhon as he rose from the earth, his body stretching from the ground to the stars, his arms reaching from east to west, his 100 dragon heads breathing fire and speaking in the voices of all the animals that had ever lived. When he challenged Zeus for supremacy, the other gods fled in terror, transforming themselves into animals and hiding in Egypt. Only Zeus remained to face the monster, and their battle shook the foundations of creation. Lightning crashed against dragonfire, thunder answered roar for roar. The battle raged across the Mediterranean, from Mount Olympus to the volcanic peaks of Sicily. At last, Zeus managed to trap Typhon beneath Mount Etna, where the monster's fiery breath still emerges as volcanic eruptions, and his struggles beneath the earth cause earthquakes that remind mortals of the cosmic forces barely held in check. With Typhon defeated, Zeus's rule was finally secure, but the king of gods faced a subtler challenge in his relationship with mortals. Unlike his father and grandfather, Zeus did not wish to rule through fear alone but sought to establish a just order that would benefit both gods and humans. Yet this noble intention would be tested by the complex web of relationships and conflicts that defined Olympian society. Zeus's marriage to Hera, his sister and queen, was both a political alliance and a passionate love affair, but it was also the source of endless conflict. Hera, goddess of marriage and family, demanded fidelity from her husband, while Zeus, embodying the principle of fertility and creative power, could not resist the call of love in its many forms. His countless affairs with goddesses, nymphs, and mortal women became the stuff of legend, each liaison producing children who would play crucial roles in the unfolding drama of myth. Consider Zeus's encounter with Leda, the beautiful queen of Sparta. Seeing her bathing by the river Eurotas, Zeus transformed himself into a magnificent swan and approached her with such grace and gentleness that she welcomed his embrace. From their union came 2 eggs, from one hatched Helen, whose beauty would launch 1,000 ships, and Pollux, the immortal twin, from the other came Clytemnestra, who would become queen of Mycenae, and Castor, Pollux's mortal brother. Or imagine Zeus's seduction of Danae, locked in a bronze tower by her father Acrisius, who had been warned that his grandson would kill him. No walls could contain the king of gods, who came to Danae as a shower of golden rain, falling through the very atoms of her prison to fill her with divine light. From this union was born Perseus, the hero who would slay the Gorgon Medusa and fulfill the prophecy his grandfather had tried so desperately to avoid. Each of these affairs provoked Hera's jealousy and rage, not merely because of wounded pride, but because she understood that Zeus's liaisons were creating a new generation of heroes and demigods who would reshape the mortal world. Her vengeance against Zeus's lovers and their children became legendary. She transformed Io into a cow and sent a gadfly to torment her across the earth. She delayed Heracles' birth so that his cousin would become king instead, and she persecuted countless others with divine fury. Yet even in her anger, Hera served a crucial function in the cosmic order. Her jealousy and revenge created the obstacles and challenges that heroes needed to prove their worth. Without Hera's opposition, Heracles would never have performed his 12 labors. Without her intervention, many of the great adventure stories would never have unfolded. In this way, the discord at the heart of the divine marriage became one of the driving forces of mythological narrative. The other Olympians, too, had their own complex relationships and spheres of influence. Athena, who had sprung fully formed from Zeus's head after he swallowed her mother Metis, became the goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare. Unlike Ares, who represented the brutal chaos of battle, Athena embodied the intelligent use of force in service of justice and civilization. She was patron of heroes like Odysseus and Perseus, guiding them not through brute strength but through cunning and wisdom. Picture Athena in her gleaming armor, her gray eyes bright with intelligence, the owl perched on her shoulder and the olive branch in her hand. She was both warrior and peacemaker, the goddess who taught mortals the arts of civilization, weaving, pottery, navigation, and the cultivation of the olive tree. When the city that would bear her name was founded, she competed with Poseidon for the honor of being its patron. Poseidon struck the ground with his trident and brought forth a spring of salt water, while Athena planted the first olive tree, offering the gift of peace, prosperity, and wisdom. The people chose her gift, and Athens became her sacred city. Apollo, the son of Zeus and the Titaness Leto, embodied the principle of order, beauty, and rational thought. His birth was itself a story of divine intervention and cosmic significance. When Leto was pregnant with Zeus's children, for she carried twins, Hera's jealousy pursued her across the earth, forbidding any land to give her sanctuary. At last, the floating island of Delos offered refuge, and there Leto gave birth first to Artemis, who immediately assisted in the birth of her twin brother Apollo. Apollo became the god of music, poetry, prophecy, and the sun's light. Imagine him as the Greeks did, eternally youthful, golden-haired, with a lyre in his hands and the light of divine knowledge in his eyes. His oracle at Delphi became the most sacred site in the Greek world, where mortals could seek divine guidance through the riddling prophecies of the Pythia, priestess who spoke with Apollo's voice. The establishment of the Delphic oracle itself tells us much about Apollo's nature. When he came to Delphi as a young god, the site was guarded by Python, a monstrous serpent born from the mud left behind by the Great Flood. This dragon represented the old, chthonic powers of the earth, the feminine principle of mysterious, intuitive knowledge. Apollo slew Python with his silver arrows, establishing the supremacy of rational, masculine wisdom over the darker, more ancient forms of prophecy. Yet even in victory, Apollo showed wisdom. He established the Pythian Games to honor the slain dragon and instituted rituals of purification to cleanse himself of the blood guilt. The priestess he appointed to deliver his oracles was called the Pythia in honor of the defeated serpent, showing that the new order incorporated rather then simply destroyed the old. Artemis, Apollo's twin sister, became the goddess of the hunt, the moon, and virginity. Where Apollo represented the civilizing influence of culture and rational thought, Artemis embodied the wild freedom of nature. She was patron of young women, protector of children and animals, and the embodiment of independence and self-determination. When still a child, she sat on Zeus's knee and asked for eternal virginity, a silver bow and arrows, a pack of hunting hounds, and a band of nymphs to serve as her companions. Zeus, delighted by his daughter's precocious wisdom, granted all her requests. Picture Artemis running through the moonlit forests, her silver bow in hand, followed by her pack of white hounds and her band of nymph companions. She was both protector and destroyer, gentle to those who honored her but terrible in her vengeance against those who violated her sacred laws. When the hunter Actaeon accidentally saw her bathing, she transformed him into a stag, and he was torn apart by his own hunting dogs. When the people of Thebes boasted that their mortal women were more beautiful than the goddess, she and Apollo slew all their children with plague arrows. Yet Artemis could also show mercy and protection. She was the guardian of Iphigenia, whom she rescued from sacrifice by Agamemnon, spiriting her away to serve as a priestess in her temple. She protected young women in childbirth, despite her own virginity, and was especially beloved by those who chose to remain unmarried. Aphrodite, born from the sea foam created by Uranus's severed member, was the goddess of love, beauty, and sexual desire. Her power was perhaps the most fundamental of all the Olympians, for love was the force that drove creation itself. She was married to Hephaestus, the craftsman god, but her heart belonged to Ares, the god of war. Their affair produced Harmonia, who would marry Cadmus and found the royal house of Thebes, and Eros, the god of passionate love who would become his mother's constant companion. The marriage of Aphrodite and Hephaestus tells us much about the Greek understanding of love and beauty. Hephaestus was the only Olympian who was not physically perfect, born lame. He was cast out of heaven by his mother Hera, who was ashamed of his deformity. Yet he became the greatest craftsman in creation, forging wonders that even the gods treasured. His marriage to the most beautiful goddess represented the union of inner worth with outer beauty, of skill with inspiration, of the practical with the ideal. When Hephaestus discovered his wife's affair with Ares, he crafted an invisible net so fine that it could not be seen but so strong that it could hold the gods themselves. He trapped the lovers in their embrace and called the other Olympians to witness their shame. But the plan backfired, the gods laughed at the spectacle, and Apollo remarked that he would gladly suffer such embarrassment for a night with Aphrodite. The incident revealed the complex Greek attitude toward love and marriage, honor and desire, showing that even divine relationships were subject to the same tensions that troubled mortal hearts. Ares himself, the god of war, was perhaps the least loved of the Olympians, even by his own father Zeus. Unlike Athena's strategic warfare, Ares represented the brutal, chaotic aspect of battle, the bloodlust and savagery that civilized people both needed and feared. He was worshipped more fervently in Sparta than anywhere else, where his values of courage and martial prowess were most highly prized. Picture Ares in his bronze armor, his spear gleaming with blood, accompanied by his terrible companions Phobos and Deimos, fear and panic, and by Io, the goddess of violent conflict. Yet even this fearsome god had his vulnerabilities. In Homer's Iliad, when he is wounded by the mortal hero Diomedes, with Athena's aid, he flees to Olympus crying like a child, only to be scolded by Zeus for his cowardice and violence. Demeter, goddess of the harvest and agriculture, embodied the nurturing aspect of the earth's fertility. Her story is inseparable from that of her daughter Persephone, and their myth became one of the most important in Greek religion, explaining the cycle of the seasons and offering hope for renewal after death. The tale begins with Persephone gathering flowers in a meadow, her laughter echoing across the fields as she played with her companions, the ocean nymphs. She was the picture of youthful innocence, her arms full of narcissus and roses, her hair crowned with violets. She did not see Hades watching from a crack in the earth, his dark eyes burning with sudden love for the maiden's beauty. The lord of the underworld had been granted permission by Zeus to take Persephone as his bride, but neither the girl nor her mother knew of this arrangement. When Persephone reached for a particularly beautiful narcissus, a flower planted by Gaia at Zeus's request to lure the maiden, the earth split open, and Hades emerged in his chariot drawn by black horses. Before Persephone could cry out, he swept her up and plunged back into the underworld, the earth closing behind them with a sound like thunder. Demeter heard her daughter's terrified scream echoing across the mountains and sea, but when she arrived at the meadow, she found only trampled flowers and an eerie silence. For 9 days and nights, she searched the earth, carrying torches to light her way, asking every creature she met if they had seen her beloved daughter. Only the sun, who sees all things from his position in the sky, could tell her what had happened, but he was forbidden to speak. On the 10th day, Demeter encountered Hecate, the goddess of magic and crossroads, who had heard Persephone's cry but had not seen her abduction. Together they went to Helios, the sun god, and demanded the truth. Reluctantly, Helios told them of Zeus's arrangement and Hades' violent courtship, suggesting that Demeter should be honored that her daughter had married the lord of the underworld. But Demeter was not honored, she was enraged. In her grief and fury, she withdrew her gift of fertility from the earth. The crops withered in the fields, the trees bore no fruit, and famine threatened all living things. The goddess herself, disguised as an old woman, wandered the earth in mourning, coming at last to Eleusis, where she was kindly received by the royal family. In Eleusis, Demeter served as nursemaid to the infant Demophon, son of King Celeus. So grateful was she for the kindness shown by his family that she decided to make the child immortal by burning away his mortality in the sacred fire. Each night she placed him in the flames, and each day he grew more beautiful and godlike. But when his mother Metanira spied on the ritual and screamed in terror at seeing her baby in the fire, the spell was broken. Demeter revealed her true form, filling the palace with divine light, and commanded that a temple be built to her at Eleusis. There she would establish the mysteries, sacred rites that would offer initiates hope for a blessed afterlife. But first, her daughter must be returned, for without Persephone, the earth would remain barren forever. Zeus, seeing that all life on earth was threatened by Demeter's grief, finally sent Hermes to the underworld to negotiate Persephone's return. Hades, though reluctant to give up his bride, could not refuse a direct command from the king of gods. But before he let Persephone go, he offered her a few pomegranate seeds as a parting gift. Persephone, eager to return to her mother in the upper world, thoughtlessly ate them. This single act sealed her fate, for the pomegranate was the food of the dead, and anyone who ate in the underworld was bound to return there. When Hermes brought Persephone back to the upper world and she was joyfully reunited with Demeter, the shadow of those pomegranate seeds hung over their happiness. Through the intervention of Zeus, a compromise was reached. Persephone would spend part of each year with her mother in the upper world, and part with her husband in the realm of the dead. And so the cycle of seasons was established. When Persephone returns to the earth, Demeter's joy causes flowers to bloom and crops to grow. This is spring and summer. When Persephone descends to the underworld, Demeter mourns, and the earth becomes barren. This is autumn and winter. The myth gave the Greeks a way to understand the natural cycle of death and renewal that governs all life, while the mysteries of Eleusis offered initiates personal participation in this cosmic drama of loss and recovery. Hermes, the messenger god, played crucial roles in many myths as the divine herald who carried communications between the worlds of gods and mortals, and between the living and the dead. Born in a cave on Mount Cyllene, Hermes showed his cleverness from his first day of life. While still an infant, he crept from his cradle, found a tortoise, and fashioned from its shell the first lyre. Then he stole a herd of cattle belonging to his half-brother Apollo, driving them backwards so their hoofprints would confuse any tracker. When Apollo discovered the theft and dragged the baby before Zeus for judgment, Hermes played the lyre he had invented, and the music was so beautiful that Apollo agreed to trade his cattle for the instrument. Thus began a friendship between the two gods that would endure throughout their myths. Zeus, delighted by his youngest son's precocious cleverness, made him the messenger of the gods and gave him a herald's staff, winged sandals, and a traveler's hat. Hermes became the guide of souls to the underworld, the protector of merchants and thieves, the god of boundaries and crossroads. He was the divine trickster, using wit and cunning rather than brute force to achieve his goals. In his role as psychopomp, guide of souls, he helped mortals navigate the transition from life to death, showing them the way to Hades' realm with gentleness and compassion. Hephaestus, despite his physical imperfection, was honored as the craftsman of the gods and the patron of all who worked with their hands. His forges beneath Mount Etna and other volcanoes produced wonders that amazed even the immortals, the palace of the gods on Olympus, Zeus's thunderbolts, the golden servants who assisted him in his work, and countless other marvels that combined practical function with divine beauty. The story of Hephaestus's birth reveals much about Greek attitudes toward physical perfection and inner worth. When Hera bore him, she was so ashamed of his lameness that she cast him from Olympus. He fell for a full day before landing in the ocean, where he was rescued and raised by the sea nymphs Thetis and Eurynomy. In their underwater grotto, he learned the arts of metalworking and jewelry making, crafting beautiful ornaments for his foster mothers. When Hephaestus reached maturity, he crafted a golden throne as a gift for Hera, but it was a trap. When the queen of gods sat upon it, invisible chains bound her fast, and no one could free her. The Olympians pleaded with Hephaestus to release his mother, but he refused unless she acknowledged him as her son and welcomed him to Olympus. Only when Dionysus got him drunk and convinced him to return to his birthplace was Hera freed, and mother and son were reconciled. This story illustrates the Greek belief that wisdom and skill were more valuable than physical beauty, and that even the humblest craftsman possessed a form of divine power. Hephaestus's creations were so lifelike that they seemed ready to speak, so beautiful that they made mortals weep with longing, so skillfully made that they would last until the end of time. Poseidon, lord of the seas, rivers, and earthquakes, was both creator and destroyer, the god whose moods could bring prosperity through favorable winds and calm seas, or devastation through storms and tsunamis. His realm was vast. Not just the visible ocean, but all the waters of the earth, from the smallest spring to the mightiest river. He was also the god of horses, for the Greeks saw a connection between the wildness of untamed stallions and the untamed power of the sea. The birth of Poseidon's most famous child, the winged horse Pegasus, came about through one of mythology's strangest encounters. Medusa, one of the three Gorgon sisters, had once been a beautiful priestess of Athena. But when Poseidon violated her in Athena's temple, the goddess punished not the rapist but the victim, transforming Medusa into a monster whose gaze could turn living beings to stone. When Perseus later beheaded Medusa, Pegasus sprang from her blood, the offspring of her union with Poseidon, born in the moment of her death. This myth reveals the darker aspects of divine power and the complex ways in which the Greeks understood justice and injustice. Medusa's transformation was both punishment and protection. Her monstrous appearance kept her safe from further assault, while her deadly gaze gave her power over those who would harm her. Yet she remained a victim, isolated and feared until Perseus ended her suffering. Hades, ruler of the underworld, was perhaps the most misunderstood of the major gods. Though his realm was the destination of the dead, he was not evil in the Christian sense of the term, but rather the stern and just administrator of the afterlife. His kingdom was divided into different regions: the Elysian fields for the heroic and virtuous, the fields of Asphodel for ordinary souls, and Tartarus for those who had committed terrible crimes against gods and mortals. The underworld itself was a vast and complex realm, separated from the world of the living by 5 rivers: Styx, the river of hate that bound the gods to their oaths; Acheron, the river of woe; Lethe, the river of forgetfulness that erased memories of mortal life; Cocytus, the river of lamentation; and Phlegethon, the river of fire. The entrance was guarded by Cerberus, the 3-headed dog who welcomed the dead but prevented any from leaving. Hades rarely left his shadowy kingdom, but when he did, it was usually to address matters that affected the cosmic order. His abduction of Persephone was motivated not by casual lust but by a deep longing for companionship in his lonely realm. As lord of the underworld, he possessed immense wealth. All the precious metals and gems that lay buried in the earth belonged to him, but wealth meant little without someone to share it with. The marriage of Hades and Persephone, despite its violent beginning, became in many versions of the myth a genuine love story. Persephone grew to understand her husband's loneliness and came to appreciate the quiet dignity with which he ruled over the dead. She became queen of the underworld in truth as well as in name, showing mercy to those who deserved it and justice to those who required punishment. Among the first generation of mortals created by the gods, Prometheus stands out as a figure of cosmic significance. A titan who had sided with Zeus during the war against his fellow titans, Prometheus became the champion of humanity, the divine being who cared more for mortal welfare than for his own safety. The creation of humanity itself was a collaborative effort between Prometheus and his brother Epimetheus. Working with clay and water, they fashioned the first human beings, but while Prometheus gave his creations intelligence, foresight, and the spark of divine reason, Epimetheus distributed various gifts to all the other creatures: speed to the deer, strength to the lion, flight to the birds, protective shells to the tortoises. When he came to humanity last, he had no gifts left to give. Seeing that his brother had left humanity defenseless and vulnerable, Prometheus took pity on his creations. He stole fire from the forge of Hephaestus and brought it to earth, along with the knowledge of crafts, agriculture, medicine, and astronomy. Fire was more than just a practical tool, it was the symbol of civilization itself, the divine spark that elevated humanity above the beasts. Zeus was furious at this theft, for fire was meant to be the exclusive possession of the gods. As punishment, he had Prometheus chained to a rock in the Caucasus Mountains, where each day an eagle would come to tear out his liver, and each night the organ would regenerate, ensuring eternal torment. The hero would suffer this fate until Heracles finally freed him thousands of years later, but Prometheus never regretted his sacrifice, believing that humanity's progress justified any personal suffering. But Zeus's revenge was not complete with Prometheus's punishment. The king of gods also sought to punish humanity itself for accepting the stolen gift. He commanded Hephaestus to create the first woman, fashioning her from clay with divine artistry. Each of the gods contributed something to this creation. Aphrodite gave her beauty, Athena taught her domestic skills, Hermes gave her a silver tongue but also a deceitful nature. This first woman was named Pandora, meaning all-gifted, and she was sent to Epimetheus as a bride. Despite his brother's warnings about accepting gifts from Zeus, Epimetheus was enchanted by Pandora's beauty and married her immediately. As a wedding gift, Zeus gave them a beautiful jar, often mistranslated as a box, with strict instructions never to open it. But curiosity was part of Pandora's nature, as Zeus had intended. Unable to resist the mystery of the sealed jar, she finally lifted the lid. Immediately, all the evils that would plague humanity rushed out: disease, old age, sorrow, envy, hatred, war, and countless other miseries. Pandora tried desperately to close the jar, but it was too late. Only one thing remained inside: hope, which Zeus had placed there to ensure that humanity would never completely despair, even in the face of suffering. The story of Pandora reflects the Greeks' complex attitude toward women and knowledge. Like even the Hebrew tradition, Pandora was both the source of humanity's downfall and an essential part of the human condition. Her curiosity, though it brought suffering, also represented the drive to understand and explore that would lead to humanity's greatest achievements. The early generations of mortals lived in a golden age under the rule of Kronos, when the earth provided food without cultivation, when there was no war or disease, and when death came as gently as sleep. But as the ages passed, humanity declined through silver, bronze, and finally to the Iron Age, when Zeus ruled and mortals knew toil, sorrow, and violent conflict. Yet even in the Iron Age, heroes arose who embodied the best qualities of humanity. These heroes were often the children of gods and mortals, inheriting divine power while retaining human hearts. Their stories became the foundation of Greek epic poetry and the inspiration for countless generations of mortals who dreamed of achieving glory through noble deeds. Perseus, son of Zeus and the mortal Danae, was among the first of the great heroes. His quest to slay Medusa began not from a desire for glory but from necessity. His grandfather Acrisius, having heard a prophecy that he would be killed by his grandson, had imprisoned Danae in a bronze tower to prevent her from bearing children. But Zeus came to her as a shower of golden rain, and Perseus was conceived. When Acrisius discovered his daughter's child, he could not bring himself to kill his own grandson directly, so he set Danae and the infant Perseus adrift in a wooden chest, hoping the sea would accomplish what he could not. But Poseidon guided the chest safely to the island of Seriphos, where a kind fisherman named Dictys found them and raised Perseus as his own son. Perseus grew to be a strong and noble young man, but his peaceful life was shattered when Polydex, the king of Seriphos and Dictys' brother, fell in love with Danae. When she refused his advances, Polydex devised a plan to rid himself of her protective son. He announced that he was marrying another woman and demanded wedding gifts from all his subjects. Perseus, having no wealth to offer, rashly promised to bring any gift the king desired. Polydex smiled coldly and requested the head of Medusa, knowing that this quest would almost certainly mean Perseus's death. But the young hero had divine allies. Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, appeared to him with advice and gifts. She gave him a polished bronze shield that could serve as a mirror, allowing him to look at Medusa without meeting her deadly gaze directly. Hermes provided winged sandals for swift flight, a helmet of invisibility borrowed from Hades, and an adamantine sword sharp enough to cut through the Gorgon's bronze skin. Perseus's journey took him to the edge of the world, where the three Greek ancient sisters who shared a single iron tooth among them, guarded the path to the Gorgon's lair. By stealing their eye at the moment they passed it from one to another, Perseus forced them to reveal the location of their sisters. The Gorgons dwelt in a cave beyond the Western Ocean, where the sun sets and eternal twilight reigns. As Perseus approached their lair, he could see the evidence of Medusa's terrible power, a garden of stone statues that had once been living men and beasts, all frozen in expressions of terror at the moment they glimpsed her face. Using Athena's shield as a mirror, Perseus crept carefully through this petrified landscape until he found the three sisters sleeping. Stheno and Euryale were immortal, their bronze scales glinting even in sleep, their brass hands folded over their hearts. But Medusa, once the most beautiful of the three, lay between them, her serpent hair writhing even in dreams. Perseus raised his sword and, guided by her reflection in his shield, struck with perfect precision. Medusa's head was severed in a single blow, and from her neck sprang Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, a giant bearing a golden sword. The death of Medusa awakened her immortal sisters, who pursued Perseus with fury and grief. But his winged sandals carried him swiftly away, and Hades' helmet rendered him invisible to their seeking eyes. As he flew over the desert of Libya, drops of blood from Medusa's head fell to the sand, and where they landed, serpents were born, which is why that land has been full of snakes ever since. Perseus's return journey became an adventure in itself. Flying over Ethiopia, he saw a beautiful woman chained to a rock by the seashore, with a terrible sea monster approaching through the waves. This was Andromeda, daughter of King Cepheus and Queen Cassiopeia. Her mother had boasted that her daughter was more beautiful than the Nereids, the sea nymphs who served Poseidon. In his anger at this hubris, the sea god had sent the monster Cetus to ravage the Ethiopian coast. The oracle had declared that only by sacrificing Andromeda to the monster could the kingdom be saved. Perseus, moved by the maiden's plight and her beauty, offered to slay the monster in exchange for her hand in marriage. King Cepheus agreed, and Perseus rose into the air, drawing the creature's attention away from Andromeda. The battle between Perseus and Cetus was fierce but brief. The hero's divine weapons and supernatural speed gave him every advantage, and soon the monster lay dead in the bloodied waters. But when Perseus claimed his bride, he faced another challenge. Andromeda had been betrothed to her uncle Phineus, who arrived with an army to reclaim her. Perseus found himself vastly outnumbered, but he possessed the ultimate weapon. Warning Andromeda to close her eyes, he drew forth Medusa's head. The sight of the Gorgon's face turned Phineus and his soldiers to stone instantly, creating another garden of statues to mark Perseus's triumph. Returning at last to Seriphos with his bride, Perseus discovered that Polydex had been persecuting his mother Danae, trying to force her into marriage. Perseus arrived at the very moment when the king was threatening Danae in his palace before an assembly of nobles. Once again, Medusa's head served its purpose. Polydex and his court were turned to stone, their expressions of cruelty frozen forever. With his quest complete and his mother safe, Perseus gave the divine weapons back to Hermes and presented Medusa's head to Athena, who placed it on her aegis, where it would strike terror into her enemies for all time. Perseus and Andromeda ruled justly over Seriphos for many years before founding the great city of Mycenae. The prophecy about Perseus killing his grandfather was fulfilled in an unexpected way. Years later, competing in athletic games, Perseus threw a discus that was caught by the wind and struck Acrisius, who was watching from the crowd. Thus fate accomplished what could never be avoided, showing that divine will works through seemingly random events as surely as through direct intervention. The story of Perseus established many of the patterns that would recur in later hero myths: the divine parentage, the seemingly impossible quest, the magical aids provided by friendly gods, the rescue of a maiden in distress, and the inevitable fulfillment of prophecy despite all human efforts to prevent it. But perhaps no hero's story has captured the imagination more completely than that of Heracles, the strongest mortal who ever lived, whose labors took him to every corner of the known world and beyond. Born from Zeus's union with the mortal woman Alcmene, Heracles was marked for greatness from the moment of his conception, but also for suffering through the relentless enmity of Hera. Alcmene was the wife of Amphitryon, a noble warrior of Thebes. When Zeus desired her, he took the form of her husband and came to her while Amphitryon was away at war. The god prolonged the night of their union, commanding Helios not to drive his chariot across the sky, so that their time together lasted as long as 3 normal nights. When the real Amphitryon returned and also lay with his wife, Alcmene conceived twins, Heracles by Zeus and Iphicles by her mortal husband. Hera's jealousy was aroused not just by Zeus's infidelity but by his boast that a descendant of Perseus born that day would become the greatest king of his generation. Through her divine power, she delayed Heracles' birth while hastening that of his cousin Eurystheus, ensuring that Zeus's prophecy would apply to the wrong child. When Heracles was finally born, Hera sent 2 enormous serpents to strangle him in his cradle. But even as an infant, the child showed his divine strength. He grasped the snakes by their necks and strangled them with his bare hands, laughing with delight as their coils went limp. This was the first sign of the remarkable destiny that awaited him. As Heracles grew, his strength increased beyond all measure. He was taught music by Linus, brother of Orpheus, but when the teacher tried to discipline him, Heracles struck him with his own lyre and killed him instantly. Though he was acquitted of murder on the grounds of self-defense, Amphitryon decided to send his stepson away to tend cattle on Mount Cithaeron, hoping that country life would teach him self-control. On the mountain, Heracles grew to enormous size and strength. When he reached manhood, standing 8 feet tall with muscles like iron and eyes that flashed with divine fire, he faced the first great choice of his life. As he sat contemplating his future, 2 women appeared to him, one beautiful and voluptuous, promising him a life of pleasure and ease, the other noble and austere, offering him a path of virtue and hardship that would lead to immortal glory. Heracles chose virtue, beginning the heroic career that would make his name immortal. His first great deed was to kill the lion of Cytheron, a massive beast that had been preying on the herds of both Amphitryon and the neighboring king Thespius. The hunt lasted 50 days, during which Heracles was entertained by Thespius, whose 50 daughters all became mothers of the hero's children, though some say this happened over 50 nights, while others claim it was accomplished in a single night of divine passion. When Heracles returned to Thebes wearing the lion's skin as a cloak, he found his city threatened by the minions of Orchomenus, who demanded tribute. King Creon was prepared to pay, but Heracles rallied the Theban youth and led them in a successful rebellion. In gratitude, Creon gave Heracles his daughter Megara in marriage, and for a time the hero enjoyed domestic happiness. But Hera's hatred had not abated. When Heracles was at the height of his contentment, with 3 sons from his beloved wife, the goddess sent madness upon him. In his frenzy, he believed his children were enemies and killed them with his own hands. When the madness lifted and he saw what he had done, his grief was boundless. Seeking purification for this terrible crime, Heracles consulted the oracle at Delphi. Apollo's priestess told him he must serve his cousin Eurystheus, the cowardly king of Tiryns, for 12 years, performing whatever labors were demanded of him. Only through this service could he atone for his children's deaths and achieve the immortality that was his divine birthright. Thus began the 12 labors of Heracles, tasks designed by Eurystheus and Hera to be impossible for any mortal to complete. But Heracles was more than mortal, and his divine strength was matched by courage, determination, and an increasingly clever approach to seemingly unsolvable problems. The first labor was to slay the Nemean lion, a monstrous beast with a hide so tough that no weapon could pierce it. The lion had been terrorizing the hills around Nemea, devouring both humans and livestock. Heracles tracked the creature to its lair, a cave with 2 entrances. He blocked one entrance with boulders and entered through the other, confronting the lion in the darkness. When his arrows bounced harmlessly off the lion's hide and his sword shattered against its skull, Heracles realized he must use different tactics. Grappling with the beast using his bare hands, he locked his powerful arms around its neck and strangled it slowly, methodically, until its struggles ceased. Then, using the lion's own razor-sharp claws, he skinned the carcass and fashioned its hide into armor that would protect him throughout his remaining labors. The second labor took him to the swamps of Lerna, where the Hydra lurked, a serpentine monster with 9 heads that regenerated 2 heads for every one that was cut off. The creature's breath was so poisonous that it could kill with a single exhalation, and its blood was equally deadly. Heracles approached the Hydra's lair with his nephew Iolaus driving his chariot. As the monster reared up from the swamp, its multiple heads weaving hypnotically, Heracles began cutting them off with his sword. But the heads grew back faster than he could sever them, and soon he faced 18 heads instead of 9. Thinking quickly, Heracles called for Iolaus to bring burning brands from their chariot. As Heracles cut off each head, his nephew seared the neck stump with fire, preventing regeneration. When only the central, immortal head remained, Heracles crushed it beneath an enormous boulder. Then he dipped his arrows in the Hydra's venomous blood, ensuring that even minor wounds from his weapons would be fatal. The third labor required him to capture the Ceryneian hind, a golden-horned deer sacred to Artemis. This task seemed simple compared to battling monsters, but the deer was as swift as the wind and could run without tiring. Heracles pursued it for an entire year, chasing it across Greece and into the land of the Hyperboreans, beyond the north wind. Finally, as the hind paused to drink at a stream, Heracles shot an arrow that pinned its forelegs together without drawing blood. As he carried the captured deer back to Tiryns, he encountered Artemis and Apollo, who demanded to know why he had violated the sacred animal. Heracles explained his predicament, emphasizing that he had been careful not to harm the deer and that he served under divine compulsion. Artemis, impressed by his respect for her sacred beast, allowed him to complete the labor on condition that he release the hind as soon as Eurystheus had seen it. The fourth labor sent him after the Erymanthian boar, a massive creature that was devastating the countryside around Mount Erymanthus. On his way to hunt the boar, Heracles stayed with the centaur Pholus, who entertained him with food and wine. The wine was special, a gift from Dionysus meant to be shared among all the centaurs. When its aroma spread through the forest, the other centaurs arrived and demanded their share, but the wine drove them into a violent frenzy. Heracles was forced to defend himself and his host, driving off the mad centaurs with arrows dipped in hydra venom. Tragically, several centaurs died from these poisoned arrows, including Chiron, the wisest of their kind and teacher of heroes. Though the wound was not fatal to an immortal, the hydra's poison caused Chiron constant agony, and he eventually chose to give up his immortality to Prometheus in exchange for release from suffering. Having dealt with this unexpected complication, Heracles continued his hunt for the boar. He drove the beast into deep snow where its movements were slowed, then captured it with nets and carried it back alive to Eurystheus. The king was so terrified by the sight of the living boar that he hid in a bronze jar and communicated with Heracles only through a herald. The fifth labor took Heracles to Elis, where King Augeas owned 3,000 cattle that had not had their stables cleaned in 30 years. The accumulated filth was enormous, mountains of dung that had turned the fertile plain into a wasteland. Eurystheus commanded Heracles to clean these stables in a single day, assuming the task was impossible. But Heracles had learned to use his intelligence as well as his strength. He diverted two rivers, the Alpheus and Peneus, from their courses and channeled their combined waters through the stables. The torrential flow washed away 30 years of accumulated waste in a few hours, leaving the stables spotless and the surrounding fields newly fertile. King Augeas had promised to pay Heracles 1/10 of his cattle for completing this task, but when he learned that the hero was acting under compulsion as part of his labors, he refused to honor the agreement. Heracles would later return to claim his payment by force, killing Augeas and instituting the Olympic Games to celebrate his victory. The sixth labor required Heracles to drive away the Stymphalian birds, man-eating creatures with bronze beaks and metallic feathers they could shoot like arrows. These birds had multiplied unchecked around Lake Stymphalus, terrorizing the local population and poisoning the waters with their excrement. The problem was not defeating the birds but getting them to come out of their dense forest where they roost in enormous numbers. Athena provided the solution, bronze castanets forged by Hephaestus that produced a sound so loud and piercing that it panicked the birds into flight. Standing on a hilltop, Heracles clashed the castanets together with divine strength, creating a noise like thunder that echoed across the lake. The terrified birds rose in a cloud so dense it darkened the sky, and as they fled, Heracles shot them down with his poisoned arrows. Those he didn't kill fled to the island of Ares in the Black Sea, never to return. For the seventh labor, Heracles traveled to Crete to capture the bull that Poseidon had sent from the sea. King Minos was supposed to sacrifice this magnificent white bull to the sea god, but its beauty had so impressed him that he substituted another animal, keeping Poseidon's bull for his own herds. In punishment, Poseidon made the bull savage and uncontrollable, and also cursed Minos' wife Pasiphae to fall in love with it. From this unnatural union would eventually be born the Minotaur, but that is another story. For now, the bull rampaged across Crete, destroying crops and killing anyone who approached it. Heracles wrestled with the bull barehanded, demonstrating his strength by overcoming the creature that had defeated all of Crete's warriors. He carried it across the sea to the Peloponnese, where he showed it to Eurystheus before releasing it. The bull wandered to the plain of Marathon, where it continued to cause trouble, until it was finally killed by Theseus years later. The eighth labor took Heracles to Thrace, where King Diomedes owned 4 horses that fed on human flesh. These were no ordinary horses but wild, savage beasts that their master fed with the bodies of strangers who visited his kingdom. Heracles arrived with a band of volunteers, including his beloved friend Abderus. While his companions held off Diomedes and his men, Heracles captured the horses and began driving them toward his ship. But during the battle, Abderus was killed and partially devoured by the very horses he was guarding. In his grief and rage, Heracles fed King Diomedes to his own horses, and their hunger for human flesh was satisfied so completely that they became docile as lambs. He founded the city of Abdera in honor of his fallen friend and drove the tamed horses back to Eurystheus, who dedicated them to Hera. The ninth labor required Heracles to obtain the golden girdle of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons. These were warrior women who lived beyond the Black Sea, daughters of Ares who had cut off their right breasts to draw their bows more easily. The girdle was a gift from Ares himself, symbol of Hippolyta's authority over her people. This labor began peacefully. When Heracles arrived at the Amazon capital of Themyscira, Hippolyta received him kindly and, impressed by his fame and noble bearing, agreed to give him the girdle willingly. But Hera, disguised as an Amazon warrior, spread rumors that the Greek hero planned to kidnap their queen. The Amazons attacked Heracles' ship, and in the confused battle that followed, Hippolyta was killed, whether by accident or design, the stories differ. Heracles fought his way clear with the girdle, but he mourned the loss of the noble queen who had shown him such honor. For the 10th labor, Heracles journeyed to the far west, beyond the pillars that marked the edge of the known world, to steal the cattle of Geryon. This monster had 3 bodies joined at the waist, making him incredibly difficult to fight, and his cattle were guarded by the 2-headed dog Orthus and the giant herdsman Eurytion. The journey itself was an epic adventure. To cross the ocean, Heracles borrowed the golden cup that Helios used to sail back to the east each night after driving the sun across the sky. When the waves threatened to overturn the cup, Heracles drew his bow and threatened to shoot the ocean itself, so intimidating Poseidon that the sea god calmed the waters. Reaching the island of Erythea where Geryon lived, Heracles killed both the dog and the herdsman with his club, then faced the 3-bodied monster himself. It was like fighting 3 warriors simultaneously, but Heracles managed to line up his opponents so that a single arrow could pass through all 3 bodies, and the Hydra's poison did the rest. Driving the cattle back across Europe proved almost as difficult as capturing them. At every stop, local kings tried to steal part of the herd, bandits attacked him, and the cattle themselves constantly tried to scatter. In the Alps, he had to clear a path through the mountains, and in southern France, he founded the city of Monaco. When he finally reached Greece, Hera sent a gadfly that scattered the cattle across the countryside, and Heracles spent months gathering them again. The 11th labor took Heracles to the garden of the Hesperides, where the golden apples grew that Gaia had given to Hera as a wedding gift. The location of this garden was a mystery, somewhere beyond the setting sun, guarded by the dragon Ladon that never slept. Heracles wandered for months seeking the garden, having adventures in Egypt where he killed the giant Busiris, in Libya where he wrestled with the giant Antaeus who drew strength from his Mother Earth, and in the Caucasus where he freed Prometheus from his eternal torment. Finally, the Titan told him the secret. Only Atlas, who held up the sky, knew the location of his daughter's garden. Heracles found the giant at the western edge of the world, bearing the celestial sphere on his shoulders. Atlas agreed to fetch the apples if Heracles would hold up the sky in his absence. The hero accepted this crushing burden, feeling the weight of all the stars pressing down upon him. When Atlas returned with the golden apples, he announced that he would deliver them to Eurystheus himself, leaving Heracles to hold the sky forever. But Heracles had learned cunning as well as strength. He agreed to Atlas's plan, but asked the Titan to take back the sky for just a moment while he adjusted his lion skin cloak to better cushion his shoulders. Atlas, thinking himself very clever, set down the apples and resumed his burden. Heracles immediately grabbed the apples and left, calling back his thanks as he departed. The 12th and final labor was the most dangerous of all, to bring back Cerberus, the three-headed hound that guarded the entrance to Hades. This task required Heracles to descend to the underworld itself, a journey that few mortals had ever attempted and fewer still had survived. Before making this ultimate descent, Heracles was initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries, learning the sacred rites that would help him navigate the realm of the dead. Guided by Hermes and protected by Athena, he found the entrance to Hades in a deep cave and began his descent into darkness. The underworld was a vast realm of shadows, populated by the spirits of all who had ever died. As Heracles walked among them, most fled in terror from his living warmth and the lion's skin that marked him as a hero. But some recognized him and begged for his aid. He encountered Theseus and Pirithous, who had been imprisoned in stone chairs for attempting to kidnap Persephone. Heracles was able to free Theseus, though part of his friend's flesh remained stuck to the chair, but Pirithous was held too firmly for even the hero's strength to release. Finally, Heracles reached the throne room of Hades, where the Lord of the Dead sat beside his queen Persephone. To his surprise, Hades received him courteously and listened to his request. The god agreed to let Heracles take Cerberus, but on one condition: he must overpower the monster using only his bare hands, without weapons of any kind. Heracles found Cerberus at the gates of Hades, a massive dog with 3 heads, a serpent for a tail, and snakes growing from his back. The beast's eyes glowed like coals, and his breath was the cold of the grave itself. But Heracles had no fear. He wrapped his powerful arms around Cerberus's necks, ignoring the bites of the serpentine tail and mane, and slowly squeezed until the great hound submitted to his will. Leading Cerberus up from the underworld was like dragging night itself into the light of day. When they emerged at Treason, the monster's shadow was so terrible that it caused the aconite plant to spring from the earth wherever it fell. Eurystheus took one look at the 3-headed dog and fainted with terror, begging Heracles to return the creature immediately to its proper realm. With the completion of the 12 labors, Heracles had achieved what seemed impossible. He had atoned for his crime and proven himself the greatest hero of his age. But his adventures were far from over. He went on to participate in the quest for the Golden Fleece, to rescue Alcestis from death itself, and to engage in countless other heroic deeds. His second marriage, to Deianira, daughter of King Enyeus, began with another heroic act. The river god Aclaus had been courting Deianira, appearing to her sometimes as a man, sometimes as a serpent, sometimes as a bull with a human face. When Heracles arrived and also sought her hand, the two rivals fought for the right to marry her. Aclaus used all his shape-shifting powers, but Heracles was equal to each form. When the river god became a serpent, Heracles strangled him. When he became a bull, Heracles wrestled him to the ground and tore off one of his horns. Defeated, Aclaus yielded the maiden, and the horn he lost became the cornucopia, the horn of plenty that would forever provide abundance to whoever possessed it. Heracles and Deianira lived happily for several years, but their contentment was shattered by another accident. At a dinner party, a young cupbearer spilled wine on Heracles, and the hero cuffed him in annoyance. The blow was light by Heracles' standards, but it killed the boy instantly. Though the death was clearly accidental and the boy's father forgave him, Heracles felt he must go into exile again. He and Deianira set out for Trachis, where his friend King Ceyx would welcome them. On the journey, they came to the river Evenus, where the centaur Nessus offered to carry Deianira across while Heracles swam. But Nessus had evil intentions. In the middle of the stream, he tried to assault Deianira. Her screams alerted Heracles, who shot the centaur with one of his hydra-poisoned arrows. As Nessus lay dying, he gave Deianira a vial of his blood, telling her it was a love potion that would ensure Heracles' faithfulness if she ever feared he was straying. Years later, when Heracles fell in love with the captive princess Iole and seemed to be neglecting his wife, Deianira remembered the centaur's gift. She soaked a magnificent robe in Nessus's blood and sent it to her husband as a peace offering. The moment Heracles put on the robe, it began to burn his flesh, for the centaur's blood had been poisoned by the hydra's venom. The robe clung to his skin like liquid fire, and every attempt to remove it only tore away more flesh. The poison that had made his arrows so deadly now tortured him with agony that even his divine constitution could not endure. Realizing that she had been deceived and had caused her beloved husband's doom, Deianira hanged herself in grief. Heracles, knowing that his mortal life was ending, climbed Mount Ida and built a great funeral pyre. He lay down upon the burning wood, asking his friend Philoctetes to light the fire. As the flames consumed his mortal body, Zeus sent down lightning to carry his son's soul to Olympus. There Heracles was welcomed among the gods, reconciled with Hera, and married to her daughter Hebe, the goddess of youth. The hero who had been born to suffer became at last what he had always been destined to be, immortal, honored among both gods and mortals as the greatest of all heroes. The story of Theseus, the great hero of Athens, parallels that of Heracles in many ways, but where Heracles relied primarily on strength, Theseus combined physical prowess with intelligence and political wisdom. His adventures established him not just as a monster slayer but as the founder of Athenian democracy and the unifier of Attica. Theseus was born in Treason, son of Princess Aethra and either King Aegeus of Athens or the sea god Poseidon. The stories differ, and perhaps both were his fathers in different ways. Aegeus had come to Treason seeking an heir, for an oracle had told him he would have a son who would become the greatest king Athens had ever known. Before leaving Treason, Aegeus placed his sword and sandals beneath a huge boulder, telling Aethra that when their son was strong enough to lift the stone, he should take these tokens and come to Athens. Theseus grew up not knowing his father's identity, raised by his mother and grandfather King Pittheus. When Theseus reached manhood and easily lifted the stone, retrieving the sword and sandals, he chose to travel to Athens by the dangerous overland route rather than the safe sea voyage. The road was infested with bandits and monsters, but Theseus was eager to prove himself by clearing the way for peaceful travelers. His first encounter was with Periphetes, called the Club-Bearer, a giant who killed travelers with an enormous bronze club. Theseus wrestled the weapon away from him and beat him to death with his own club, which became Theseus's favorite weapon thereafter. Next he met Cenes, the pine bender, who would tie travelers between two bent pine trees and release them, tearing his victims apart. Theseus gave Cenes a taste of his own medicine, demonstrating that justice sometimes requires the punishment to fit the crime exactly. At the Isthmus of Corinth, he encountered Siren, who forced travelers to wash his feet and then kicked them off a cliff to be devoured by a giant turtle below. Theseus pretended to comply but grabbed Siren's feet and hurled him over the precipice instead. Further along the road, he met Circean, king of Eleusis, who challenged all passers-by to wrestling matches to the death. No one had ever defeated the giant king until Theseus demonstrated superior technique, lifting Circean high above his head and dashing him to the ground with such force that his neck broke. The last and strangest of the bandits was Procrustes, who offered hospitality to travelers in his roadside inn. But Procrustes had only one bed, and he insisted that all his guests fitted exactly, stretching short people on a rack until they were tall enough, or cutting off the legs of tall people until they were the right size. Theseus dealt with this madman by giving him the same treatment, cutting off his head to make him fit his own bed. By the time Theseus reached Athens, his fame had preceded him. King Aegeus recognized his son by the sword he carried, but their reunion was complicated by the presence of Medea, the sorceress who had become Aegeus's wife after her exile from Corinth. Medea saw Theseus as a threat to her own son's inheritance and tried to poison him at a welcome feast. But Aegeus recognized his sword just as Theseus was about to drink the poisoned wine. The king struck the cup from his son's hand and embraced him, while Medea fled Athens in her dragon-drawn chariot, never to return. Theseus's greatest adventure began when the tribute ship arrived from Crete. Years earlier, after a war between Athens and Crete, King Minos had imposed a terrible penalty. Every 7 years, Athens must send 7 young men and 7 young women to be devoured by the Minotaur, the bull-headed monster that lived in the labyrinth beneath his palace. This creature was the offspring of Minos's wife Pasiphae and the white bull that Poseidon had sent from the sea. When Minos refused to sacrifice the bull as promised, the god had cursed his wife with an unnatural passion for the animal. The master craftsman Daedalus had constructed a wooden cow covered with hide, allowing Pasiphae to satisfy her desire, and from this union was born the Minotaur, human in body but with a bull's head and an insatiable hunger for human flesh. To contain the monster, Daedalus had built the labyrinth, a maze so complex that no one who entered could ever find their way out. The sacrificial victims from Athens were pushed into this maze and left to wander in darkness until the Minotaur found and devoured them. When the time came for the third tribute, Theseus volunteered to be one of the 7 young men, despite his father's anguished protests. He promised Aegeus that if he succeeded in killing the Minotaur, he would change the ship's black sails to white on the return journey, signaling his victory from afar. The tribute ship reached Crete, and the 14 young Athenians were presented to King Minos. But Minos's daughter Ariadne was among the spectators, and she fell instantly in love with the handsome hero from Athens. That night, she came to Theseus in his prison and offered to help him escape the labyrinth if he would take her back to Athens as his wife. Ariadne had consulted Daedalus, the labyrinth's creator, who gave her a ball of thread and advice on how to navigate the maze. She gave Theseus the thread, instructing him to tie one end to the entrance and unwind it as he went deeper into the labyrinth. By following the thread back, he would be able to find his way out again. The next morning, Theseus and his companions were pushed into the labyrinth. While the others huddled near the entrance, Theseus ventured deeper into the maze, following passages that twisted and turned, branched and doubled back, leading always downward into darkness. The walls were stained with the blood of previous victims, and the air grew thick with the smell of death. At the heart of the labyrinth, Theseus found the Minotaur sleeping among the bones of its victims. The creature was even more terrible than he had imagined, twice the size of a man, with the body of a giant and the head of a bull, its breath steaming in the underground cold, its eyes glowing red in the darkness. The battle was fierce but brief. The Minotaur had never faced an armed opponent, only defenseless victims, and Theseus was one of the greatest warriors of his generation. Using his sword and the techniques his grandfather had taught him, he killed the monster and then followed Ariadne's thread back to the entrance. The escape from Crete required careful planning. Theseus and his companions, joined by Ariadne, had to reach their ship and get away before their escape was discovered. They managed to board and sail away under cover of darkness, but their freedom came at a price that would haunt Theseus forever. The ship stopped at the island of Naxos for supplies, and there Theseus abandoned Ariadne while she slept. The reasons for this betrayal vary in different versions of the story. Some say he was commanded by the gods, others that he fell out of love with her, still others that he was simply callous in his moment of triumph. But the result was the same. Ariadne awoke to find herself alone on the beach, watching the Athenian ship disappear over the horizon. Her lamentations moved even the gods to pity. Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy, found her weeping on the shore and fell in love with her beauty and her sorrow. He comforted her and made her his wife, eventually placing her crown among the stars as the constellation Corona. Thus, Ariadne's betrayal led to divine love and immortal honor, showing that even the cruelest turns of fate can lead to unexpected blessings. But Theseus paid a terrible price for his abandonment of the woman who had saved his life. In his excitement at returning home victorious, he forgot to change the ship's sails from black to white. King Aegeus, watching from the cliffs above Athens, saw the black sails and believed his son was dead. Overcome with grief, he threw himself into the sea, which has been called the Aegean ever since in his memory. Theseus returned to find himself king of Athens, but his joy in victory was poisoned by sorrow at his father's death. He ruled wisely and well, uniting the scattered communities of Attica under Athens's leadership and establishing the democratic institutions that would make the city famous. He welcomed refugees and freed slaves, declaring that Athens would be a haven for all who sought justice and freedom. Yet even as king, Theseus could not resist the call of adventure. He joined the Argonauts in their quest for the Golden Fleece, helped Heracles in several of his labors, and participated in the war against the Amazons, where he captured their queen Antiope and made her his wife. His marriage to Antiope produced a son, Hippolytus, who would become a great hunter devoted to Artemis. But the marriage also brought war, for the other Amazons invaded Attica to rescue their queen. The battle raged through the streets of Athens itself, with the warrior women fighting from horseback with bows and battle axes against the Greek infantry. The war ended only when Antiope was killed, some say by her own sister's spear as she fought beside Theseus, others that she threw herself between her husband and an Amazon arrow meant for him. With their queen's death, the surviving Amazons withdrew, leaving Theseus to mourn another woman whose love had brought her only sorrow. Later, Theseus married Phaedra, sister of Ariadne and daughter of King Minos. It seemed like a diplomatic marriage that would heal the old wounds between Athens and Crete, but it brought new tragedy instead. Phaedra fell passionately in love with her stepson Hippolytus, who rejected her advances out of devotion to Artemis and respect for his father. Maddened by rejected love and shame, Phaedra hanged herself but left a note accusing Hippolytus of trying to seduce her. Theseus, believing his wife's lie, called upon his divine father Poseidon to punish his son. The sea god sent a bull from the waves that spooked Hippolytus's horses as he drove his chariot along the shore. The young man was dragged to death, another victim of the curse that seemed to follow Theseus's romantic entanglements. The truth came out too late. Artemis herself appeared to Theseus and revealed Phaedra's deception and his son's innocence. The hero who had slain the Minotaur was helpless against the monsters of jealousy and deceit that destroyed his own family. In his old age, Theseus made one last, foolish adventure. His friend Pirithous, king of the Lapiths, convinced him to help kidnap Persephone from the underworld so that Pirithous could marry the queen of the dead. This act of hubris led to their imprisonment in Hades, where they sat bound to stone chairs until Heracles freed Theseus during his final labor. Theseus returned to Athens to find his city in chaos, ruled by a usurper who had taken advantage of the king's mysterious absence. Unable to regain his throne, the hero went into exile on the island of Scyros, where the local king, fearing his reputation, pushed him off a cliff to his death. Thus ended the life of Theseus, a hero who had saved Athens from the Minotaur's tribute, founded democratic institutions, and performed countless acts of bravery, yet who was ultimately defeated by his own flaws and the inexorable workings of fate. The greatest adventure story of all Greek mythology was the quest for the Golden Fleece, an epic that brought together heroes from across the Greek world in a single, magnificent enterprise. The fleece itself was the golden wool of a flying ram that had once rescued the children Phrixus and Helle from their murderous stepmother. The ram, sent by Zeus in answer to their prayers, had carried the children across the sea toward safety. But Helle grew dizzy from the great height and fell into the strait that would forever after bear her name, the Hellespont. Phrixus reached the land of Colchis at the far end of the Black Sea, where King Aedes welcomed him and gave him his daughter in marriage. In gratitude for his rescue, Phrixus sacrificed the golden ram to Zeus and gave its fleece to Aeetes, who hung it on an oak tree in a grove sacred to Ares, where it was guarded by a dragon that never slept. The fleece became a symbol of kingship and divine favor, glowing with its own inner light and possessing the power to restore youth and vitality to whoever touched it. Years later, in the city of Iolcus in Thessaly, Prince Jason returned from his education under the centaur Chiron to claim the throne that rightfully belonged to him. His uncle Peleus had usurped power from Jason's father and ruled through fear and oppression. But an oracle had warned Peleus to beware of a man with one sandal, and when Jason arrived wearing only one shoe, having lost the other while helping an old woman, the goddess Hera in disguise, across a flooding river, the usurper knew his doom was approaching. Rather than yield the throne, Peleus challenged Jason to prove his worth by bringing back the golden fleece from Colchis. The task seemed impossible. Colchis lay thousands of miles away across dangerous seas, and even if Jason could reach it, the sleepless dragon made theft of the fleece appear hopeless. But Jason was not deterred. With the help of the master shipwright Argus and the guidance of Athena, he commissioned the construction of the greatest ship ever built. The Argo was crafted from timber cut on Mount Pelion, with a speaking beam from Zeus's sacred oak at Dodona built into her prow. She was swift as a dolphin, strong as an oak, and blessed by the gods themselves. When news spread that Jason was assembling a crew for this legendary voyage, heroes came from every corner of Greece to join the expedition. Heracles brought his incredible strength and his nephew Hylas. Orpheus came with his magical lyre that could charm wild beasts and make trees dance. The twins Castor and Pollux contributed their skill with horses and boxing. Atalanta, the huntress, offered her deadly accuracy with bow and arrow. The winged sons of the north wind, Zets and Calais, brought their power of flight. There was Admetus, whose wife would later die for him, Peleus, future father of Achilles, Telamon, father of the great Ajax, Meleager, who would slay the Caledonian boar, the seer Idmon, who knew he would die on the journey but came anyway because fate required it, and many others whose names were already legendary or would become so. The Argonauts, as they came to be called, set sail from Iolcus on a spring morning when the winds were favorable and the sea sparkled like wine. Their departure was attended by crowds of well-wishers, for the whole city understood they were witnessing the beginning of an adventure that would be remembered forever. Their first stop was the island of Lemnos, inhabited only by women who had killed all their men in a fit of jealous rage sent by Aphrodite. The goddess had been offended when the Lemnian women neglected her worship, so she cursed them with a terrible odor that drove their husbands to take concubines from Thrace. In their fury, the women murdered not only their husbands but every male on the island. Queen Hypsipyle and her women welcomed the Argonauts eagerly, for they needed men to father a new generation. The heroes were happy to oblige, and they might have stayed on Lemnos permanently if Heracles had not reminded them of their mission. Jason himself was reluctant to leave, for he had fallen in love with Hypsipyle, who bore him twin sons. Continuing their journey, the Argonauts faced their first great challenge at the entrance to the Dardanelles, where the Symplegades or clashing rocks guarded the passage to the Black Sea. These enormous stones would slam together whenever a ship tried to pass between them, crushing vessels and sailors alike. On the advice of the blind prophet Phineus, whom they had rescued from the Harpies, the Argonauts sent a dove through the passage first. The bird barely escaped, losing only its tail feathers as the rocks crashed together. In the moment when the stones rebounded apart, the Argonauts rowed with superhuman effort. There was bending under the strain. The Argo shot through the gap just as the rocks began to close again, losing only her stern ornament to the grinding stone. The ship's passage broke the spell forever. The Symplegades became fixed in their open position, never to threaten sailors again. The Black Sea proved to be as dangerous as its name suggested. Storms battered the Argo, sea monsters attacked from the depths, and hostile tribes shot arrows at them from the shore. They lost Heracles and Hylas when the youth was kidnapped by water nymphs who fell in love with his beauty, and the great hero abandoned the quest too. search for his beloved companion. At the island of Ares, they encountered the Stymphalian birds that Heracles had driven away during his labors. The bronze-feathered creatures attacked the Argonauts with metal feathers sharp as spears, but the heroes protected themselves with shields and drove the birds away with the sound of clashing bronze. On the same island, they rescued the sons of Phrixus, who had been shipwrecked while trying to reach Greece to claim their grandfather's inheritance. These young men proved invaluable guides, for they knew the way to Colchis and could speak the local language. Finally, after months of travel and countless adventures, the Argos sailed up the river faces to Aea, the capital of Colchis. King Aeetes received them with formal hospitality, but his heart was full of suspicion and anger. The fleece had brought him prosperity and power for decades, and he had no intention of giving it up to a band of foreign adventurers. When Jason explained his mission and requested the fleece, Aeetes appeared to agree but set conditions that seemed impossible to fulfill. Jason must yoke 2 fire-breathing bulls with bronze hooves, plow a field with them, sow the furrows with dragon's teeth, and defeat the armed warriors who would spring from the planted teeth. Only then would the king consider giving him the fleece. Jason accepted the challenge, though his heart sank at the apparent impossibility of the task. But the gods had not abandoned him. Hera, who favored the Argonauts because of Peleus' impiety, asked Aphrodite to make Aeetes' daughter Medea fall in love with Jason. Medea was no ordinary princess but a powerful sorceress, priestess of Hecate and granddaughter of the sun god Helios. She possessed magical knowledge that could turn the impossible into the merely difficult. When Eros shot her with his arrow at Aphrodite's command, she fell instantly and completely in love with the handsome young hero. That night, Medea met Jason secretly in the temple of Hecate. By moonlight, she gave him a magical ointment that would protect him from fire and bronze for one day, and she told him the secret of defeating the dragon-teeth warriors. When they arose from the furrows, he should throw a stone among them, and they would fight each other instead of him. The next morning, before a crowd of Colchians who had come to watch the foreign prince die, Jason approached the bronze bulls. These were magnificent and terrible creatures, crafted by Hephaestus himself, with brass hooves and nostrils that breathed flame hot enough to melt bronze. But protected by Medea's ointment, Jason felt their fire as no more than a warm breeze. He seized the first bull by its horns and wrestled it to the ground, slipping the yoke over its neck before it could recover. The second bull charged him, flame streaming from its mouth, but Jason vaulted over its head and yoked it as well. Then, guiding the team with ropes, he plowed the designated field in perfect furrows. When he sowed the dragon's teeth, armed warriors immediately began sprouting from the earth, fully grown and eager for battle. But Jason remembered Medea's advice. He threw a boulder into their midst, and the warriors, not knowing who had attacked them, began fighting each other with savage fury. Within minutes, they had all killed each other, leaving Jason standing victorious in the field. King Aeetes was furious that his plan had failed, but he could not openly refuse to honor his agreement without losing face before his people. He pretended to agree to give Jason the fleece but secretly planned to attack the Argonauts that night and kill them all. Medea, however, had overheard her father's plans. Once again she met Jason in secret, this time offering to help him steal the fleece immediately if he would swear to marry her and take her back to Greece. Jason eagerly accepted, for he had come to love the sorceress who had saved his life. Together they crept through the night to the sacred grove where the golden fleece hung on its oak tree. The guardian dragon was enormous, as thick as a ship's mast and longer than the Argo herself, with eyes that glowed like lanterns and breath that withered the grass. It had never slept since the fleece was placed in its care. But Medea possessed herbs that could charm even dragons. She sang to the great serpent in the ancient language of magic, sprinkling her potions on its head until its eyelids grew heavy and its coils relaxed. As the monster sank into enchanted sleep, Jason quickly climbed the oak and retrieved the fleece. The golden fleece was more beautiful than either of them had imagined. It shone with its own inner light, warm to the touch and seeming to pulse with divine life. When Jason wrapped it around his shoulders, he felt strength and vitality flowing into his body, and Medea gasped at how godlike he appeared. But there was no time to marvel at their prize. Dawn was approaching, and soon Aedes would discover the theft. Jason and Medea ran back to the harbor, where the Argonauts were waiting with the ship ready to sail. As the sun rose, the Argo was already rowing out to sea, carrying the fleece and its new guardians toward home. The return journey proved even more perilous than the voyage out. Aedes pursued them with his fleet, and only Medea's terrible stratagem saved them. She had brought her young brother Absyrtus with them as a hostage, and when the Colchian ships drew near, she killed the boy and scattered his dismembered body on the waters. Aedes stopped to gather his son's remains for proper burial, and the Argonauts escaped. This murder horrified even Jason's hardened companions and brought the wrath of Zeus upon them. The speaking beam of the Argo declared that they must seek purification for the innocent blood that had been shed, and so their homeward journey became a wandering through unknown seas. They sailed up the Danube River, crossed by land to the Adriatic, and were swept by storms to the coast of Libya, where they had to carry the Argo across the desert to reach the Mediterranean. They visited Circe, Medea's aunt, who purified them of the murder but warned that greater trials lay ahead. At the island of the Sirens, whose songs lured sailors to their death, Orpheus saved them by playing his lyre more beautifully than the monster women could sing. The Sirens were so shamed by their defeat that they hurled themselves into the sea and were transformed into the rocky islands that still bear their name. They passed between Scylla and Charybdis, the six-headed monster and the deadly whirlpool, guided safely through by the sea nymph Thetis, who would later become the mother of Achilles. They survived the attack of the bronze giant Talos on Crete, whom Medea defeated by removing the plug from his ankle that held in his immortal blood. Finally, after a full year of wandering, the Argo reached Iolcus, where King Peleus waited with secret plans to kill Jason and his companions. But the usurper had underestimated both Jason's heroic following and Medea's magical power. Medea convinced Peleus's own daughters that she could restore their father's youth by cutting him up and boiling him in a cauldron with magical herbs. To demonstrate, she rejuvenated an old ram by this method. But when the trusting daughters killed their father and placed him in the cauldron, Medea used different herbs, and Peleus died in agony. Jason was now technically king of Iolcus, but the people were horrified by the method of Peleus's death. Rather than rule over unwilling subjects, Jason and Medea went into exile in Corinth, where they lived happily for 10 years and had 2 children. But Jason's happiness was not destined to last. When King Creon of Corinth offered him his daughter Glauce in marriage, Jason saw an opportunity to improve his political position and secure his children's future. He divorced Medea and prepared to marry the Corinthian princess. Medea's rage at this betrayal was terrible to behold. The woman who had sacrificed everything for Jason, her family, her homeland, her innocence, now found herself cast aside for a younger woman who could offer greater political advantages. Her fury burned hotter than the Colchian bull's fire, and her revenge would be more terrible than any monster the Argonauts had faced. On the morning of Jason's wedding, Medea sent a beautiful robe and golden crown to the bride, claiming them as reconciliation gifts. But the garments were cursed with poison that burst into flames when worn. Glauce died in agony, and when her father tried to save her, he too was consumed by the magical fire. Even this revenge was not enough for Medea. To hurt Jason most deeply, she killed their own children with her own hands, then escaped in a chariot drawn by dragons sent by her grandfather Helios. Jason was left alone, his new wife dead, his children murdered, his former wife vanished into the air like a nightmare. The hero who had won the Golden Fleece lived out his remaining years as a broken man, wandering from city to city, telling anyone who would listen about the great adventure of his youth. He died at last when a rotting timber from the abandoned Argo fell on his head as he slept beneath the ship for shelter, a fitting end for a man whose greatest triumph had led to his greatest tragedy. The quest for the Golden Fleece had brought together the greatest heroes of the age, but their success came at a terrible price. The fleece itself, object of so much desire and struggle, disappeared from history, its golden glow dimmed by the blood that had been shed to possess it. Yet the story lived on, inspiring countless other tales of heroic adventure and serving as a reminder that even the most glorious achievements can carry within them the seeds of their own destruction. The Argonauts had reached beyond the boundaries of the known world and brought back wonders, but they had also learned that some prizes are too costly to be worth their winning. Among all the great adventures of the heroic age, perhaps none has captured the imagination more completely than the tale of the Trojan War, that 10-year conflict that brought together heroes from across the Greek world in a struggle that would reshape the ancient Mediterranean. The war's causes were complex, rooted in divine jealousy, mortal pride, and the inevitable clash between fate and free will. The story begins with a wedding that was meant to bring peace but instead ignited the greatest war in mythological history. Peleus, one of the Argonauts and king of Phthia, was to marry the sea nymph Thetis, daughter of Nereus. This marriage had been arranged by Zeus himself, for it had been prophesied that Thetis would bear a son greater than his father. Originally, both Zeus and Poseidon had desired the beautiful sea goddess, but when they learned of the prophecy, they quickly decided she should marry a mortal instead. Peleus was chosen for his heroic reputation and noble character, and the wedding was to be celebrated with all the splendor that befitted a union blessed by the gods. All the deities were invited to the wedding feast except one, Eris, the goddess of discord, who had been deliberately excluded because her presence always brought trouble. But Eris was not one to accept such a slight quietly. She appeared at the celebration uninvited and threw a golden apple among the guests, inscribed with the words, "To the fairest." 3 goddesses immediately claimed the apple: Hera, queen of the gods and goddess of marriage; Athena, goddess of wisdom and war; and Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. Each was convinced that she was obviously the most beautiful and therefore deserved the golden prize. The dispute threatened to disrupt the wedding entirely, and none of the male gods dared to choose between the 3 rivals. Finally, Zeus declared that the decision should be made by Paris, a mortal prince of Troy who was said to be an excellent judge of beauty. Paris was not living as a prince at the time. When he was born, his mother Queen Hecuba had dreamed that she gave birth to a flaming torch that would burn down Troy. The soothsayers interpreted this as meaning that the child would bring destruction to the city, so King Priam had ordered his exposure on Mount Ida. But the baby was rescued by shepherds and raised as one of their own, growing into a young man of extraordinary beauty and wisdom. Hermes led the 3 goddesses to Mount Ida, where Paris was tending his flocks. The young shepherd was overwhelmed by the divine beauty before him, but each goddess sought to influence his decision with promises of rewards. Hera offered him power, promising to make him ruler of all Asia and the most powerful king on earth. Her voice carried the authority of heaven itself, and her promise glittered with the allure of dominion over nations and peoples. Athena offered him wisdom and glory in war, promising that he would become the greatest warrior who ever lived, victorious in every battle, his name sung by poets until the end of time. Her gray eyes flashed with the light of strategic genius, and her words painted visions of heroic deeds that would echo through eternity. But Aphrodite offered him love, promising him the most beautiful woman in the world as his wife. She smiled with lips like rose petals and spoke in a voice like honey, weaving dreams of perfect love and absolute beauty that would make Paris the envy of every man alive. Paris was young and romantic, and the goddess of love's promise stirred his heart as power and glory could not. He awarded the golden apple to Aphrodite, earning her eternal gratitude and the equally eternal enmity of Hera and Athena. Aphrodite kept her promise, but the most beautiful woman in the world was already married. Helen was the daughter of Zeus and Leda, born from one of the swan eggs that resulted from Zeus's transformation. Her beauty was so extraordinary that when she reached marriageable age, suitors came from every corner of Greece to seek her hand. Her earthly father, King Tyndareus of Sparta, feared that choosing one suitor over the others would lead to war, so he made all the suitors swear an oath to defend Helen's marriage and protect her chosen husband from any who might try to take her away. The oath was sworn over the sacrificed pieces of a horse, making it sacred and unbreakable. Helen chose Menelaus, king of Sparta, as her husband, and for several years they lived happily together, blessed with a daughter named Hermione. But fate had other plans for the most beautiful woman in the world. Guided by Aphrodite, Paris found his way to Sparta during Menelaus's absence on a diplomatic mission to Crete. Helen welcomed the handsome young stranger with the customary hospitality, but from the moment their eyes met, both felt the irresistible power of the goddess of love at work. Some versions of the story say that Helen left willingly with Paris, overwhelmed by a passion that made her forget her duties as wife and mother. Others claim that Paris kidnapped her while she was under the influence of Aphrodite's magic. But all agree that when Menelaus returned from Crete, he found his palace empty and his honor destroyed. The betrayed king's rage was terrible to behold, but worse was his grief at losing the wife he truly loved. He called upon all the former suitors of Helen, reminding them of their sacred oath to protect his marriage. One by one, the kings and heroes of Greece took up arms, some reluctantly, others eagerly, but all bound by the oath they had sworn over the sacrificed horse. Agamemnon, Menelaus's brother and High King of Mycenae, took command of the expedition. He was a powerful but arrogant ruler, skilled in war but lacking in wisdom, whose leadership would prove both a strength and a fatal weakness to the Greek cause. Odysseus, the clever king of Ithaca, tried to avoid the war by feigning madness, yoking a horse and ox together and plowing his fields with salt. But the messenger Polymedes placed Odysseus's infant son Telemachus in front of the plow, and when Odysseus swerved to avoid harming the child, his sanity was proved. Forced to honor his oath, he became one of the Greeks' most valuable warriors and advisors. The great Ajax, son of Telamon and cousin of Achilles, brought his enormous size and strength to the cause. He stood head and shoulders above other men, carried a shield like a tower, and was said to be the strongest man in the Greek army after Achilles himself. Diomedes, young king of Argos, joined the expedition despite his youth, bringing with him a reputation for both courage and wisdom. He would prove to be one of the war's greatest heroes, favored by Athena and feared even by the gods themselves. Nestor, the aged king of Pylos, came despite his advanced years, bringing 3 ships and the wisdom of long experience. His counsel would prove invaluable during the long siege, and his stories of earlier heroic deeds would inspire the younger warriors. But the greatest of all the Greek heroes was reluctant to join the expedition. Achilles, son of Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis, was still barely more than a boy, but his mother had received a prophecy that if he went to Troy, he would win immortal glory but die young. If he stayed home, he would live a long life in obscurity. Thetis tried to hide her son by disguising him as a girl and placing him among the daughters of King Lycomedes on the island of Skyros. But Odysseus discovered the deception by bringing gifts to the king's daughters, jewelry and fine clothes, but also a sword and shield hidden among them. While the real girls examined the feminine gifts, Achilles immediately grasped the weapons, revealing his true nature. Faced with the choice between long life and immortal glory, Achilles chose glory. He joined the expedition with his companion Patroclus and his band of Myrmidons, warriors so devoted to him that they would follow him to the gates of Hades itself. The Greek fleet assembled at Aulis, but when they tried to sail for Troy, the winds died completely. The ship sat motionless on the glassy sea while supplies ran low and the army grew restless. The seer Calchas revealed that Artemis was angry with Agamemnon for boasting that he was a better hunter than the goddess herself. To appease Artemis and secure favorable winds, Calchas declared that Agamemnon must sacrifice his eldest daughter Iphigenia. The king was torn between his love for his child and his duty to the expedition, but finally he sent word to his wife Clytemnestra to bring Iphigenia to Aulis, claiming that the girl was to be married to Achilles. When Clytemnestra arrived with Iphigenia, expecting to witness her daughter's wedding, she instead found preparations for a sacrifice. Her pleas for mercy were ignored, and Iphigenia was led to the altar like a sacrificial lamb. But at the last moment, Artemis took pity on the innocent girl and substituted a deer on the altar. Spiriting Iphigenia away to serve as her priestess in distant Taurus. The wind immediately rose, and the Greek fleet set sail for Troy, but Clytemnestra's heart was filled with hatred for the husband who had been willing to murder their child. She would nurse that hatred throughout the long years of war, planning a revenge that would shake the house of Atreus to its foundations. The Greeks' first sight of Troy filled them with both awe and trepidation. The city stood on a hill overlooking the plain and the sea, its massive walls gleaming white in the sun, its towers reaching toward the sky like fingers of stone. It was clearly one of the greatest cities in the world, wealthy from trade and strong in war, protected by walls that seemed impregnable and defended by heroes whose names were already legendary. King Priam ruled Troy with wisdom and justice, beloved by his people and honored even by his enemies. His queen, Hecuba, had borne him 50 sons, of whom Hector was the greatest, a warrior prince whose courage was matched only by his devotion to his family and city. Paris, the cause of the war, had been welcomed back to Troy despite the prophecy of his birth. His beauty and charm had won over the court, and his marriage to Helen had brought the city in alliance with the goddess Aphrodite. But many Trojans viewed him with suspicion, knowing that his actions had doomed their city to war. The initial landing was fiercely contested. The Trojans, led by Hector, met the Greeks on the beach, determined to drive them back into the sea. But the first to leap from the ships was Protesilaus, who had been warned by prophecy that the first Greek to touch Trojan soil would die but who chose glory over safety. Hector killed Protesilaus with a single spear thrust, but the hero's sacrifice allowed his comrades to establish a beachhead. The Greeks pushed inland, driving the Trojans back to their city walls, and established a fortified camp on the plain before the city. Thus began the siege of Troy, a conflict that would drag on for 10 long years, consuming the lives of countless heroes and forever changing the world of gods and mortals. Neither side could achieve decisive victory. The Greeks could not breach Troy's walls, while the Trojans could not drive the invaders away. The war became a series of single combats and skirmishes, with heroes on both sides winning glory and meeting death. Achilles proved himself the greatest warrior of the age, cutting down Trojan champions like wheat before the scythe. His rage in battle was terrifying to behold. When the battle fury came upon him, his eyes blazed like fire, and enemy warriors fled in terror from his approach. But Achilles was also capable of great courtesy and nobility. When King Priam came to his tent to beg for the body of Hector, whom Achilles had killed in single combat, the young hero was moved by the old king's dignity and grief. He granted the request and even declared a truce so that the Trojans could properly honor their fallen champion. The war's course was shaped not only by mortal heroes but by the gods themselves, who took sides based on old grudges and favoritism. Hera and Athena supported the Greeks because of Paris's judgment, while Aphrodite naturally favored the Trojans. Apollo, god of prophecy and plague, sent disease into the Greek camp to punish Agamemnon's hubris, while Poseidon sometimes aided the Greeks because Troy's walls had been built by Trojan treachery. The most dramatic intervention came when Achilles withdrew from battle after a quarrel with Agamemnon over the slave girl Briseis. Without their greatest champion, the Greeks began to lose ground steadily, and the Trojans pressed their advantage, pushing the battle almost to the Greek ships. In desperation, Patroclus, Achilles' beloved companion, put on his friend's armor and led the Myrmidons into battle, hoping to rally the Greek forces. For a time, the deception worked. The Trojans fled before the figure they believed to be Achilles returned to war. But Hector, guided by Apollo, saw through the disguise and killed Patroclus in single combat, stripping him of Achilles' armor as the prize of victory. When word reached Achilles of his friend's death, his grief and rage were beyond mortal comprehension. His war cry was heard from one end of the plain to the other, and the very walls of Troy trembled at the sound. Thetis, seeing her son's anguish, commissioned Hephaestus to forge him new armor, a shield decorated with scenes of war and peace, a helmet that gleamed like a star, and a breastplate that could turn aside any weapon. Armed with these divine gifts and driven by fury at his friend's death, Achilles returned to battle. The fight between Achilles and Hector was the climax of the war, the moment when the fate of Troy was sealed. Hector knew he was doomed, but his honor and duty to his city demanded that he face the Greek champion. 3 times they ran around the walls of Troy, the pursuer and pursued, until finally Hector turned to fight. The duel was brief but decisive. Achilles' spear found the one gap in Hector's armor, piercing his throat just below the chin. As Hector lay dying, he begged Achilles to return his body to his family for proper burial, but the Greek hero's rage was still too hot for mercy. He tied Hector's corpse to his chariot and dragged it around the walls of Troy, while Priam and Hecuba watched in horror from the battlements. For 12 days, Achilles continued to dishonor Hector's body, dragging it around Patroclus's tomb each morning. But the gods were offended by this treatment of a noble enemy, and finally Zeus commanded that Hector be returned to his family. When old King Priam came alone to Achilles' tent, guided by Hermes and carrying a vast ransom, even the hardened warrior was moved by the father's grief. Achilles saw in Priam a reflection of his own father Peleus, whom he would never see again, for he knew his death was approaching. The two enemies wept together, one for his son, the other for his friend and his own approaching doom. Achilles agreed to a 12-day truce so that Troy could properly mourn its greatest defender. Hector's funeral was a magnificent affair, befitting the greatest hero Troy had ever known. His body was burned on a pyre built from timber brought from the forests of Mount Ida, and the finest warriors of Troy competed in games held in his honor. But with Hector's death, everyone knew that Troy's doom was sealed. It was now only a matter of time. Achilles himself did not long survive his enemy. When the Amazon queen Penthesilea came to aid the Trojans with her band of warrior women, Achilles killed her in single combat, but as she died in his arms, he fell in love with her beauty and courage, mourning the woman he had slain even as he gloried in his victory. Soon after, Paris, guided by Apollo, shot an arrow that struck Achilles in his one vulnerable spot, his heel, where his mother had held him when she dipped him in the river Styx to make him invulnerable. The greatest of all Greek warriors died from what would have been a minor wound to any other man, victim of the very protection that had made him nearly immortal. The Greeks fought over Achilles' body like lions over a kill, with Ajax and Odysseus bearing the brunt of the battle. When the corpse was finally secured, a great funeral was held, with games and sacrifices befitting the hero's status. But when his divine armor was offered as a prize to the worthiest Greek warrior, a bitter dispute arose between Ajax and Odysseus. Both men had strong claims, Ajax for his strength and courage, Odysseus for his cunning and leadership. When the judgment went to Odysseus, Ajax was driven mad with shame and rage. In his frenzy, he slaughtered a flock of sheep, believing them to be his enemies, and when sanity returned and he realized what he had done, he threw himself on his sword rather than live with the dishonor. With both Achilles and Ajax dead, the Greeks seemed to have lost their greatest champions. The war dragged on, with neither side able to gain decisive advantage. New allies came to Troy's aid. Memnon, the son of Dawn, arrived with an army of Ethiopians and fought valiantly before falling to a Greek spear. The prophet Helenus was captured and revealed the conditions that must be met for Troy to fall. According to Hellenes, Troy could not be taken while the Palladium remained in the city. This sacred statue of Athena had fallen from heaven and was kept in the innermost shrine of the citadel. As long as it remained there, the goddess would protect Troy from conquest. Odysseus and Diomedes undertook the dangerous mission of stealing the Palladium. Disguised as beggars, they infiltrated the city by night, murdered the guards of Athena's temple, and carried off the sacred image. With the goddess's protection removed, Troy was vulnerable at last. But the final stratagem that brought down the great city was Odysseus's masterpiece, the wooden horse. Proclaiming that the gods had commanded them to return home, the Greeks burned their camp and sailed away, leaving behind only a massive wooden horse as an offering to Athena. The horse was hollow, containing within its belly 30 of the greatest Greek warriors, including Odysseus himself. The remaining Greeks sailed only as far as the nearby island of Tenedos, where they waited for the signal to return. The Trojans found the horse on the plain and debated what to do with it. Some, like the priest Laocoon, suspected treachery and advised burning it where it stood. "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts," he warned, and threw his spear at the horse's flank, where it stuck quivering in the wood. But the gods favored the Greek stratagem. When Laocoon prepared to sacrifice to Poseidon, 2 enormous sea serpents emerged from the water and crushed him and his sons to death before the horrified eyes of the Trojans. Taking this as a sign that the gods were angry at Laocoon's impiety toward the offering, the Trojans decided to bring the horse into their city. The decision was reinforced by the testimony of Sinon, a Greek who had been deliberately left behind with a story designed to deceive the Trojans. He claimed to have deserted from the Greek army and explained that the horse was indeed an offering to Athena, built so large that it could not be brought into Troy, thus ensuring that the goddess's favor would remain with the Greeks. Against the advice of the wiser heads, the Trojans breached their own walls to bring in the massive horse. That night, as the city celebrated what they believed to be the end of the war, Helen herself came to the horse and called to the hidden warriors, imitating the voices of their wives so perfectly that several nearly answered. But Odysseus restrained his men, and when the city had fallen into wine-sodden sleep, the Greeks emerged from their hiding place. They opened the gates to their returning army and began the systematic destruction of Troy. The sack of Troy was one of the most terrible events in mythological history. The Greeks, maddened by 10 years of war and the loss of so many comrades, showed little mercy to their defeated enemies. King Priam was killed at the altar of Zeus by Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, while Queen Hecuba was taken as a slave. The Trojan women faced a fate that many considered worse than death, slavery in Greek households. Cassandra, the prophet daughter of Priam who could foresee the truth but was cursed never to be believed, was claimed by Agamemnon as his concubine. Andromache, Hector's widow, was given to Neoptolemus, while her infant son Astyanax was hurled from the walls to prevent him from growing up to avenge his father. Helen, the cause of so much suffering, was reclaimed by Menelaus, who had intended to kill her but was overcome by her beauty when he saw her cowering in Aphrodite's temple. Their reunion was complicated by years of separation and betrayal, but eventually they returned to Sparta to rule together as before. The fall of Troy was complete, its walls cast down, its temples burned, its people dead or enslaved. The great city that had stood for generations was reduced to ruins, and grass would grow where its palaces had been. The prophecy of Cassandra was fulfilled, Troy was no more. But the Greeks' victory came at a terrible cost, and their journey home would prove almost as dangerous as the war itself. The gods were angered by the sacrilege committed during the sack. Ajax the Lesser had raped Cassandra in Athena's temple, Neoptolemus had killed Priam at Zeus's altar, and many other crimes had been committed against divine law. Poseidon and Athena, who had been on opposite sides during the war, now united to punish the Greeks for their impiety. They sent storms that scattered the fleet across the Mediterranean, wrecking ships and drowning heroes who had survived 10 years of war. Agamemnon's journey was swift but led to a doom that had been building for over a decade. His wife Clytemnestra had not forgotten or forgiven the sacrifice of their daughter Iphigenia at Aulis. During the long years of his absence, she had taken a lover, Aegisthus, and together they had planned their revenge. When Agamemnon returned to Mycenae in triumph, bringing Cassandra as his war prize, Clytemnestra welcomed him with false joy. She convinced him to walk on purple cloth from his chariot to the palace, an act of hubris that offended the gods. Then, as he bathed after his long journey, she trapped him in a net and struck him down with an axe, killing both the king and his prophetic concubine. The murder of Agamemnon set in motion another cycle of revenge that would torment the house of Atreus for generations. His son Orestes, still a child when his father died, was spirited away by loyal retainers but would eventually return to avenge his father by killing his mother and her lover. Other heroes faced different but equally tragic fates. Diomedes returned home to find that his wife had been unfaithful, driven to adultery by Aphrodite's revenge for his wounding of her during the war. Ajax the Lesser was shipwrecked and would have drowned but for Poseidon's aid, yet he boasted that he had saved himself without the gods' help. For this hubris, Poseidon struck him with lightning, and he perished in the very waves from which he had been rescued. But no hero's journey home was more epic or more perilous than that of Odysseus, whose 10-year wandering would become as famous as the war itself. The king of Ithaca had been instrumental in Troy's fall through his cunning and leadership, but his journey home would test him in ways that no battle ever had. Odysseus's troubles began immediately after leaving Troy. His first stop was at Ismarus, city of the Ciconies, which his men sacked for plunder. But they lingered too long over their spoils, and Ciconi reinforcements arrived to drive them back to their ships with heavy losses. Driven off course by storms, the Greek ships reached the land of the Lotus Eaters, where the inhabitants lived in dreamy contentment, feeding on a fruit that made them forget their homes and desires. Several of Odysseus's men ate the lotus and had to be dragged back to the ships by force, weeping for the peaceful oblivion they were leaving behind. Their next encounter was with the Cyclopes, those one-eyed giants who lived in caves and knew nothing of civilization or hospitality. Odysseus and 12 of his men entered the cave of Polyphemus, son of Poseidon, hoping to receive the gifts that civilized hosts gave to travelers. But Polyphemus was savage and cruel, trapping the Greeks in his cave by rolling a massive boulder across the entrance, then eating 2 of them for his dinner and 2 more for his breakfast. Odysseus realized that brute force could not save them. Even if they could kill the giant, they would be trapped forever behind the stone that only Polyphemus was strong enough to move. Instead, Odysseus devised a cunning plan. He gave the Cyclops strong wine, and when Polyphemus asked his name, he replied that he was called Nobody. When the giant fell into a drunken stupor, Odysseus and his men heated a massive wooden stake in the fire and drove it into the monster's single eye, blinding him completely. Polyphemus's roars of pain brought other Cyclopes to his cave, but when they asked what was wrong, he could only cry out that "Nobody is hurting me. Nobody has blinded me." Assuming that he was suffering from some divine affliction that they could not help with, his relatives left him alone. The next morning, when Polyphemus rolled away the stone to let his sheep out to pasture, he sat in the entrance feeling each animal as it passed, hoping to catch the Greeks trying to escape. But Odysseus had tied his men under the bellies of the largest rams, and they passed undetected right under the giant's hands. Once safely away from the cave, Odysseus made a crucial mistake. His pride demanded that he reveal his true identity to the defeated monster, shouting back his real name and boasting of his cleverness. This allowed Polyphemus to pray to his father Poseidon for revenge, and the sea god cursed Odysseus to wander for 10 years before reaching home, and to arrive alone with all his comrades dead. The curse began to work immediately. At their next stop, the floating island of Aeolus, keeper of the winds, the god gave Odysseus a leather bag containing all the adverse winds, with only the favorable west wind left free to blow his ships home to Ithaca. For 9 days they sailed with the wind behind them, and Ithaca came into sight on the horizon. but Odysseus had been steering continuously and finally fell asleep from exhaustion. His men, curious about the contents of the mysterious bag and hoping it contained treasure that their captain was hiding from them, opened it while he slept. All the contrary winds rushed out at once, creating a hurricane that swept the ships back across the sea to Aeolus's island. When the windkeeper learned what had happened, he refused to help again, declaring that Odysseus must be cursed by the gods and that he would not interfere with divine will. The ships next reached the land of the Laestrygonians, giant cannibals who destroyed 11 of Odysseus's 12 ships and devoured most of his men. Only Odysseus's own ship escaped, with just 45 survivors of the fleet that had left Troy. Their next landfall was at the island of Aeaea, home of the sorceress Circe, daughter of Helios and mistress of magical transformations. When Odysseus sent a scouting party to explore the island, Circe welcomed them with food and drink laced with magical herbs that transformed them into swine, though they retained their human minds and wept at their degradation. Only Eurylochus escaped to bring word to Odysseus, but when the captain set out to rescue his men, he was met by Hermes in the guise of a young man. The messenger god gave him a magical herb called moly, with black roots and white flowers, that would protect him from Circe's magic. When Circe's potions had no effect on Odysseus, she realized she was dealing with no ordinary mortal. Impressed by his resistance and warned by prophecy that such a hero would one day come to her island, she became his ally and lover, restoring his men to human form and entertaining the Greeks royally for a full year. But eventually Odysseus's men began to chafe at their pleasant captivity, reminding their captain that they had homes and families waiting for them. Circe reluctantly agreed to help them continue their journey, but she warned that they must first visit the underworld to consult the prophet Tiresias about their path home. The journey to Hades was one of the most harrowing adventures in all mythology. Following Circe's directions, Odysseus sailed to the edge of the world, where the rivers Acheron and Cocytus flow into the underworld. There, at the entrance to the realm of the dead, he dug a pit and filled it with the blood of sacrificed sheep, which would give the spirits of the dead temporary strength to speak. The shades came flocking to the blood, first his mother Anticlea, whose death from grief at his long absence brought tears to the hero's eyes, then Agamemnon, who told him of Clytemnestra's betrayal and warned him to approach his own home with caution. Achilles appeared, still magnificent even in death, but when Odysseus praised him for ruling among the dead as he had among the living, the hero's shade replied with bitter words, "Better to be a living slave on earth than king of all the dead." The greatest glory, Achilles had learned too late, was not worth the sacrifice of life itself. Finally, Tiresias appeared and delivered his prophecy. Odysseus would indeed reach home, but only after losing all his men and suffering greatly. He would find his palace full of suitors who were trying to force his wife Penelope to remarry, wasting his wealth and dishonoring his name. He would have to kill them all and then undertake one final journey to appease Poseidon's anger. Armed with this knowledge and Circe's further advice about the dangers that lay ahead, Odysseus returned to the upper world and resumed his journey. The first challenge was the Sirens, those bird women whose beautiful songs lured sailors to crash their ships on the rocky shores of their island. Circe had warned him that no man could hear the Sirens' song and live, for it contained all knowledge and promised to fulfill all desires. But she had also told him how to listen safely. He plugged his men's ears with wax and had them tie him tightly to the mast, ordering them not to release him no matter how he pleaded. As they sailed past the Sirens' island, Odysseus heard their song and was filled with desperate longing to join them. He struggled against his bonds and begged his men to free him, but they only tied him more tightly and rowed faster. Only when the island was far behind did the Sirens' power release him, and he understood how close he had come to joining the whitened bones that littered their shore. The next challenge was the passage between Scylla and Charybdis, two monsters that guarded a narrow strait. Charybdis was a whirlpool that swallowed whole ships 3 times a day, while Scylla was a 6-headed monster that lurked in a cave on the opposite cliff, snatching sailors from passing vessels with her multiple heads. Circe had advised Odysseus to steer closer to Scylla, accepting the loss of 6 men rather than risking the entire ship to Charybdis. It was a cruel choice, but Odysseus followed her counsel, sailing close to the monster's lair and watching helplessly as Scylla's heads darted down to snatch 6 of his best men from the deck. Their final stop before reaching home was the island of the cattle of Helios, the sun god's sacred herd that grazed in eternal summer. Tiresias and Circe had both warned that these cattle must not be harmed, for to kill even one would bring destruction on the entire crew. Odysseus reminded his men of this warning, but they were forced to remain on the island for a month while adverse winds prevented their departure. When their supplies ran low and the men began to starve, their resolve weakened. While Odysseus slept, they slaughtered some of the sacred cattle, hoping to appease the gods with prayers and promises. But there is no atonement for sacrilege. The slaughtered cattle bellowed as if still alive, and their flesh crawled on the spits. When Helios learned of the crime, he threatened to leave the sky in darkness unless Zeus punished the offenders. As soon as they set sail, Zeus sent a thunderbolt that shattered the ship and drowned all aboard except Odysseus, who clung to a makeshift raft of broken timbers. For 9 days he drifted, until the currents carried him to the island of the nymph Calypso, daughter of Atlas. Calypso fell in love with the handsome, storm-battered hero and kept him on her island for 7 years, offering him immortality if he would remain as her husband. But Odysseus, despite the goddess's beauty and the paradise of her island, longed only for his home and his mortal wife Penelope. Finally, Athena interceded with Zeus, arguing that Odysseus had suffered enough for his sins. The king of gods commanded Calypso to release her captive, and she reluctantly provided him with tools and materials to build a raft for the final stage of his journey. But Poseidon's anger had not cooled, and when he saw Odysseus approaching the coast of Scheria, the god sent a great storm that wrecked the raft and nearly drowned the hero. Only Athena's protection and his own tremendous will to survive brought Odysseus at last to shore, naked and exhausted but alive. The island of Scheria was the home of the Phaeacians, a peaceful people skilled in navigation and favored by the gods. Their princess Nausicaa found Odysseus on the beach and, moved by his dignity despite his bedraggled condition, directed him to her father's palace. King Alcinous and Queen Arete received the stranger with honor, and when Odysseus revealed his identity and told the story of his wanderings, they were amazed by his adventures and moved by his sufferings. They provided him with a ship and crew to carry him home to Ithaca, along with rich gifts to compensate for his losses. The Phaeacian ship carried Odysseus to Ithaca while he slept, but his troubles were far from over. In his absence, 108 young nobles from Ithaca and the surrounding islands had taken up residence in his palace, courting his wife Penelope and consuming his wealth while she delayed her choice among them. Penelope had been faithful throughout her husband's 20-year absence, but the pressure on her to remarry was enormous. The suitors argued that Odysseus must surely be dead and that she should choose a new husband to rule Ithaca and father her children. To buy time, she had promised to make her choice when she finished weaving a burial shroud for her father-in-law Laertes, but each night she unraveled what she had woven during the day. Athena disguised Odysseus as an old beggar, and in this form he entered his own palace to assess the situation. He was appalled by the suitors' arrogance and waste. They were slaughtering his cattle daily for their feasts, abusing his servants, and treating his home like a public inn. Only his old dog Argos recognized him, wagging his tail weakly before dying from the joy of seeing his master again after 20 years. The faithful swineherd Eumaeus welcomed the disguised king kindly, as did his old nurse Euryclea, who recognized him by a scar on his leg but was sworn to secrecy. Penelope also spoke with the mysterious beggar, hoping for news of her husband. Though she did not recognize him, she was impressed by his dignity and wisdom. When he claimed to have news of Odysseus, she tested him by describing details of her husband's appearance and clothing, which the disguised hero easily confirmed. That night, Penelope announced that she would marry whichever suitor could string Odysseus's great bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads set in a row, a feat that only her husband had ever accomplished. The suitors eagerly accepted the challenge, but one after another failed even to string the massive bow. When the beggar asked for a chance to try, the suitors laughed and protested, but Penelope insisted that he be allowed to attempt the task. To their amazement, Odysseus strung the bow easily and sent his arrow through all 12 axe heads in a perfect line. Then, throwing off his disguise, he turned the bow on the suitors. "Dogs," he cried. "You thought I would never return from Troy. You have wasted my wealth, forced my servants, and wooed my wife while I still lived. Now you will pay the price." The battle that followed was short but bloody. Odysseus, aided by his son Telemachus, who had grown to manhood during his father's absence, the swineherd Eumaeus, and the loyal cowherd Philoetius, systematically slaughtered every one of the suitors. Those servants who had betrayed their master's trust were also executed, while those who had remained faithful were rewarded. The reunion between Odysseus and Penelope was cautious at first. She had lived too long with hope and disappointment to accept this miracle easily. But when Odysseus described the secret of their marriage bed, which he had carved from a living olive tree that still grew in their bedroom, she knew beyond doubt that her husband had truly returned. Yet even this homecoming was not the end of Odysseus's troubles. The families of the dead suitors demanded vengeance, and civil war threatened Ithaca. Only the intervention of Athena, who commanded both sides to make peace and forget their grievances, prevented further bloodshed. According to Tiresias's prophecy, Odysseus still had one final journey to make. He must carry an oar inland until he met people who had never seen the sea and who would mistake his oar for a winnowing fan. There he would sacrifice to Poseidon and finally be forgiven for blinding the god's son Polyphemus. This last journey is barely mentioned in the ancient sources, but it represents the final transformation of Odysseus from a warrior hero to a man of peace, from a wanderer to one who has found his true home not just in a place but in the acceptance of his own mortality and limitations. The stories of the Trojan War and its aftermath represent the end of the heroic age, when gods walked openly among mortals and individual heroes could shape the fate of nations through their deeds. The world that emerged from Troy's ashes was smaller, more human in scale, where wisdom mattered more than strength and where the greatest victory was simply finding one's way home. Yet these ancient tales continue to resonate because they speak to eternal truths about human nature. The prices we pay for glory, the pain of loss and separation, the power of love and loyalty to sustain us through the darkest times. In the end, the heroes of Troy and their adventures remind us that while we may not be able to choose our fate, we can choose how we face it, and in that choice lies whatever immortality is granted to mortals. As the stories of the great heroes fade into legend and the age of gods and mortals draws to its close, we find ourselves at the threshold between myth and history, between the time when anything was possible and the more constrained world we know today. Yet the echoes of those ancient tales still reach us across the centuries, whispering of wonders and terrors, of love and loss, of the eternal human struggle to understand our place in the cosmos. The Greek myths gave shape to chaos, meaning to suffering, and hope to despair. They showed that even the gods were not perfect, that even heroes must face failure and death, but that in the very act of struggle, against fate, against limitation, against the dying of the light, there was a kind of victory that transcended success or failure. In these stories, we see reflections of our own lives, our own dreams and fears. The child who hides from monsters under the bed understands Perseus facing the Gorgon. The parent who would do anything to protect their child recognizes Demeter searching for Persephone. The lover who has lost their beloved sees their pain mirrored in Orpheus's journey to the underworld. The myths remind us that we are part of a great continuum, that the same forces that moved the ancient heroes, love, ambition, fear, hope, still move within us. The same choices between courage and safety, between honor and expedience, between loyalty and self-interest, still face us daily, though perhaps in smaller, quieter forms. And in the end, perhaps that is the greatest gift these ancient stories give us, not escape from our human condition, but a deeper understanding of it, not false comfort but true wisdom, not easy answers but better questions. They teach us that it is possible to face the darkness with dignity, to love in the face of loss, to hope despite despair, and to find meaning even in the face of mortality. The gods and heroes of ancient Greece live on not in some distant Olympus but in the human heart, where their stories continue to unfold in each new generation, as fresh and vital as when they were first told around fires in the darkening hills above the wine-dark sea. And as long as human beings seek to understand themselves and their place in the universe, these tales will continue to offer their ancient wisdom, whispered like a lullaby across the ages, reminding us that we too are part of the eternal story, the myth that is still being written in the choices we make each day. Sleep now, and let these stories settle into your dreams, where they belong, where they have always lived, in the place between waking and sleeping, between knowing and wondering, between the world as it is and the world as it might be. Rest in the knowledge that you carry within you the same spark that lit the eyes of Perseus and Theseus, the same courage that drove Odysseus home across the wine-dark sea, the same capacity for love and wonder and transformation that makes mortals, in their brief time, shine as brightly as the stars themselves. The myths are ended, but the dreaming goes on, and in that dreaming, the ancient magic lives forever, as real as love, as lasting as hope, as eternal as the human spirit that refuses to accept that wonder has passed away from the world. Close your eyes, and listen. Can you hear it? The distant sound of lyres and voices, telling the old stories new, weaving the great tapestry that connects us all, mortals and gods, heroes and dreamers, in the endless, ever-beginning story of what it means to be human beneath the wheeling stars.